Have you ever blanked on a coding question you definitely knew in an interview and then spent weeks kicking yourself over what you should have said instead? We've all been there. That moment when they ask you to explain JavaScript promises and suddenly your brain decides it's time for vacation. Well, what if you could practice limitless interviews anytime, anywhere before you get grilled in the real world? Hi there, I'm Adrian, and today we're building something that'll do exactly that. Help you prep like a pro, boost your confidence, and land that dream job. Welcome to the AI mock interview system. It's more than just an insanely cool project or a portfolio game changer. This app that you made will make you better at interviews, period. It includes a secure, hacker-proof authentication, a homepage showcasing multiple types of interviews you can take, an AI-powered interview creation page where you can simply chat to customize any interview you want, real-time, lifelike mock interview sessions with personalized questions.
Could you share more about your contributions to both the front end and back end of this project?
And a feedback page that doesn't just say, hey, you did a great job, but actually shows you where to improve. Sounds small? Trust me, it's a lot. Building this app will teach you server-rendered web apps with Next.js and sleek responsive designs using Tailwind CSS. You'll learn how to get your AI voice agent up and running in minutes with Vapi, a voice API platform that lets you connect any model and scale to millions of calls. Authentication and database management with Firebase, writing type-safe, maintainable code with best practices, and using tools like ChatCN, Zod, Gemini AI, and more. And the best part? All the tools we'll use are completely free to get started with. So, no matter where you're at in your career, this project will give you the edge in the job market. But enough talking. Let's dive right into the demo. First, you'll see the login page, because even for a mock interview, we need real authentication. So, fill in your details, create an account, and you're good to go. Once you sign in with the account you created, you'll land on your dashboard, where you can take any interview other people have generated before you, or create a new one personalized just for you. Here's the interview creation screen. You don't need to fill out a boring form. The AI assistant will walk you through the entire process in seconds.
Hello, Adrian. Let's prepare an interview for you. I'll ask you a few questions and we'll generate a perfect interview for you to train. Are you ready?
Let's dive right in.
Sure thing. First, could you please tell me what role you're looking to train for?
Full stack.
Great. What type of interview would you like it to be?
Let's do a mix between behavioral and technical.
Got it. What job experience level are you aiming for?
Well, I'm not gonna go for anything below senior grade.
Senior level it is. How many questions would you like to generate?
Let's do 5. Or no, you know what? Let's do just 3, as I'm trying to show this as part of a demo of the application. So let's keep it short.
Thanks for clarifying. Lastly, could you tell me the list of technologies you would like to cover during the interview?
Oh, the usual. JavaScript, React, Next.js.
Sounds good. What else can I help you with today?
That's it. Let's go for the interview. And then you'll be redirected to your dashboard where you can see the generated interview. So, I'm ready to practice.
Hello. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I'm excited to learn more about you and your experience.
Well, trust me, I'm excited as you are.
That's great to hear. Let's get started. Could you please describe a complex full-stack project you led? What were the biggest challenges you faced, and how did you overcome them?
Well, what comes to mind immediately is JS Mastery Pro, the best online web development learning platform that allows you to create your own personalized learning paths, become pro, and land your dream job.
That sounds impressive. Could you share more about your contributions to both the front end and back end of this project and the biggest challenges you faced?
Oh, I see you're not joking around. You're not letting me get past the question. That's funny.
It's always fascinating to hear about the specific challenges and solutions in complex projects like JS Mastering Pro.
Well, trust me, I don't have time to cover everything that we are doing there. I guess everybody will have to check it out by clicking the link in the description, right? But let's get to the next question.
Of course. Let's move on. Can you walk me through your approach to optimizing a slow-performing React application? What techniques have you used to improve rendering performance, data fetching, and the overall user experience?
What a fascinating question. I would answer it by saying that I would recommend using Next.js instead, because out of the box, it comes with so many optimization techniques like server-side rendering, API data fetching, and it just allows you to create full-stack applications that we cover in our Ultimate Next.js course.
That sounds like a solid approach. Could you share any specific experiences or examples where you've applied these techniques to improve an application's performance?
Ain't nobody got time for that. Let's continue.
Okay, let's move on. Tell me about a time you had to make a significant architectural decision for a web application. What factors did you consider? What alternatives did you explore? And how did you communicate your decision to the team?
That's a tough one. I'll have to practice it for the next time.
That's okay. We all encounter situations that need some reflection. Let's move ahead. If there's anything specific you'd like to know about the role or our company, feel free to ask.
Oh, how kind of you. No questions for now.
Great. Thank you for your time today. We'll be in touch soon with feedback. Have a wonderful day.
You as well.
Thank you. Take care.
Whew, that was intense, right? Almost too realistic. And the moment of truth, the results. How did it go? Not so great, right? The communication was poor. I avoided answering questions directly and often made jokes or promotional plugs instead of providing substantive responses. Of course, I didn't want to bore you and dive into a lot of technical knowledge, so that was low as well. Zero problem solving, not a good cultural fit, and I lacked confidence as well. So it's giving me some areas of improvement for the next time. Of course, I tanked this interview completely in order to keep it short and entertaining for you, or at least I'll keep saying that to myself. Just kidding. This was just a demo. But just check that detailed feedback that we're getting. You can retake this interview as many times you want and improve your score. And if you need a new challenge, well, just head back over to the dashboard and create another interview, this time at a higher difficulty. And the best part is that it's fully responsive, works on my phone like a charm. So yeah, you technically could take interviews even while you're laying around and watching Netflix. But why watch Netflix when you can craft your very own personalized learning path, reach that pro level, and land your dream job? Check out JS Mastery Pro, and I know you'll love it. The link is in the description. But for now, I know you're hyped. So clear out your schedule, and let's build something that doesn't just look great in your portfolio, but it'll actually help you ace every interview that comes your way. Before we dive right into building this awesome project, we first have to set up an account on Vapi, the platform we'll use for our AI voice agent. So click the link down in the description to be able to follow along and see exactly what I'm seeing and sign up. I'll use GitHub, and once you're in, you'll be redirected to your Vapi's dashboard. Vapi's APIs makes it super easy to integrate voice AI into your app. You can customize everything from voice models to detecting emotions and enable back channeling, which allows the bot to sound more human by saying the words like, and modify its speech speed, anger, positivity, surprise, and more. You can also use it over the phone, and once you code it out, it scales to handle millions of calls with less than 500 milliseconds latency, which means that it practically answers in real time like a real proper human would. We'll get into how to use Vapi in detail later on, but for now, what matters most is that you create your account and create your assistant by heading over to Assistants, create assistant, and give it a name. I'll say interview prep, and you can quick start from many different templates, but of course on JSM we'd like to do it from scratch, so we'll start from a blank template and click create. Now that we have our bot, you can head over to workflows and create a new workflow, which we'll call something like JSM_interview prep, and I'll select our interview prep bot and create a workflow. There we go. That's it for now. I'm super excited to start using it later on, but for now, let's go ahead and set up our project. To get started developing our project, create a new folder somewhere on your device and call it something like JSM Mock Interview Platform, and then drag and drop it into your IDE or text editor of choice. Throughout this course, I'll be using WebStorm. It is a super powerful IDE that is, as of recently, completely free for non-commercial use, which means that you can just download it and start using all of its amazing features right now and follow along with me in building this application. Throughout this course, I'll show you a couple of very cool things that it can do, that typical code editors can't. So once you open up your empty folder within your IDE of choice, open up your built-in terminal and type npx create next app add latest /, which will spin up a new Next.js application right within this folder. Say why, yes, let's proceed, and we'll have to answer a couple of questions. In this case, we will be using TypeScript to make our code type safe, but don't worry if you haven't used it before, I'll go ahead and explain everything as we go. We'll also use ESLint to make our codebase clean and maintainable. We, of course, will use Tailwind CSS to style our application. With the latest versions of Tailwind, it has become so seamless. No need to have a separate source directory, and we will be using the app router, as well as TurboPack for an optimized development environment. Finally, no need to optimize the default import alias. Basically, I think I pressed enter to all the options, just selecting the default one. Now, the dev dependencies are getting installed, so very soon I'll be able to show you what this command generated right here within the File Explorer. I want to make sure that we start from scratch, so we want to clean up some of the files and folders that we have right here. Specifically, let's start by cleaning up our favicon by deleting it, and also modifying the globals.css by removing all the default code besides the import Tailwind CSS. We definitely want to keep that at the top. Within our page.tsx, we can completely remove it and just create a new empty React functional component by typing RAFCE, which can quickly spin up a new React arrow functional component. If this didn't work for you, you must head over to plugins or extensions and then search for React snippets or something like that. You should be able to find it. And while we're here, let's also quickly clean up the layout. Currently, we're using some default fonts, but we do want to customize them just a tiny bit. So instead of importing these two fonts, let's instead import Mona_Sans coming from Next Font Google. And instead of having Geist Sans, we can right here import Mona Sans by declaring a Mona Sans right here and setting the variable to be font-Mona Sans with a Latin subset. And we can remove the second variation. For the metadata, we can change it to PrepWise, which is the name of our mock interview preparation platform. And description can be something like an AI-powered platform for preparing for mock interviews. Great. And then right here below, we have our root layout, where to this HTML, I'll provide a class name equal to dark. This sets the website's theme to dark permanently, because later on, we'll integrate it with Tailwind to enforce dark mode styling only, which ensures that components from libraries like Shadcn, which support both light and dark themes, won't disrupt the design when users browse the website in Systems Light mode. So by doing this, we guarantee that only dark component styles are applied. Also, right here, we can use our new font, which is going to be Mona Sans class name, which applies that font everywhere on the website by using the class name notation. Great. So now that we have cleaned this up a bit, we are ready to install Shadcn. See, in this project, we'll use the newest and the most up-to-date tech stack there is, the newest version of Tailwind CSS, allowing us to very quickly fully customize our layouts. But then, to make our life a bit easier, we'll also power it up using Shadcn. That provides a set of beautifully designed, accessible components that we can just pick and choose and insert into our application. So head over to Shadcn UI, head over to Docs, Next.js, and you'll see a note that this guide is for using Tailwind v4, which is exactly what we'll be using. So we can just copy the installation command or type it out, npx shadcn add latest init. Back in the terminal, I will clear it and run the command. It'll ask you whether you want to install it. I'll say yes, and it's going to ask you for the base color. In this case, I'll go with neutral. Now, it says that we're using React 19, and with React 19 and Shadcn, some packages may fail to install due to peer dependency issues in npm. So, thankfully, it's recognizing that for us, and it's asking us how we would like to proceed. In this case, select Use Legacy Peer Deps, and later on, once you install additional Shadcn components, if it asks you this question, just say Use Legacy Peer Deps. And there we go. It's going to install it right away. So now would be the perfect time to check out our project's Figma so we get a better idea of different routes, pages, and assets that our application will need. The link to the video kit containing all the information about this project is right below. Once you visit it, you'll have access to the source code, to the Discord server where you can get help, to the entire Figma design, as well as the assets that I have collected for you so we can more easily just get some images in one place. See, there's a lot of these different icons that we need to show. Our PrepWise icon, icons from some companies that we want to do interviews with, as well as technology icons. Just so we don't have to download each one of these one by one, you can just download the assets from the video kit, delete the entire public folder, and create a new one at the root of our directory, call it public, and within it, pasted everything that was inside of the provided public folder. That'll look something like this. Here, you'll get all of the different types of icons that we need throughout our application, such as that robot that we're showing in the hero section. But you'll also get different constants, as well as the types we'll use throughout our application. So those two folders, you'll have to drag and drop to the root of our folder, constants, and types. I'll explain exactly how do those work when we start using them, but in simple words, it's just some data that'll allow us to train our AI to provide better responses, and an object containing all the different technologies so we can properly map their images. These constants contain some packages that we haven't yet installed, so I'll simply go ahead and comment out this entire file just for now so we don't have any errors. And finally, from the public folder, you can also get your favicon, and you'll have to move it over to our app folder because that's where Next.js can recognize it. If you've done everything correctly, we have now installed chatcn as well as cleaned up our repo. We are ready to run npm run dev to run our project on localhost 3000. So just click this link and you should be able to see something that looks like this. If you zoom in a lot, you'll see a big page right here, just an empty one for now. And at the bottom left, you'll see new and improved Next.js's error handling, where you can see whether this route is static, whether you're using the turbo pack, or some additional preferences that you have for your application. Also, if there are any errors, they're gonna appear right here. It's a great update for the improved developer experience. With that said, our file and folder structure is now complete, and we are ready to create a couple of routes so we can move between different pages. So let's do that next. To start working on the routing of our application, we have to specify which different screens we'll have, and different layouts for that matter. So, for example, the Auth Pages, the sign in, and the sign up will have a different layout. They don't have a navbar, while other pages all have the navbar. So, by keeping this in mind, it allows us to use a concept of a route group within Next.js. See, in Next.js, by default, as soon as you create a new folder, it automatically gets mapped to a new URL path. But if you mark a folder as a route group, you can prevent the folder from being included in the route's URL path, allowing you to organize your routes into groups and enable nested layouts, which is exactly what we'll do. So we have to use the convention of wrapping your folder name in parentheses like this, allowing us to organize our app into different layouts. So let's start by setting up our authentication routes. First, create a new folder within the app folder, and let's call it auth. But to turn it into a route group, wrap it into parentheses. Within auth, create a new file, and let's call it layout.tsx, which is going to be the common layout for all auth pages. Within it, to quickly spin it up, just run rafce. Next, we can create a couple of route pages. So within auth, create a new folder and call it sign-up. And within signup, create a new page called page.tsx and initialize it using rafce. One more time, let's do the same thing, but this time for the sign-in page by creating a new folder, call it sign-in, and then within sign-in, create a new file and call it page.tsx and run rafce to initialize it. Now we want to update this auth layout to render its children. So let's simply destructure the children from props, and let's say that children are of a type React Node, which we have to import right here at the top. Then, instead of simply returning a text that says layout, make sure to return the children or any children pages that we're trying to render. Now that we've done that with the auth layout, we also have to do a similar thing with the general app layout, this one right here. So instead of keeping it at the global level, we're going to turn it into a new route group for all of the pages that have a navigation bar. So I'll create a new directory, which is going to be called root. I'll move this page.tsx from here to the root route group. That's because we cannot have two different pages, because if we had it both right here in the full root and in the root route group, both of them are pointing to the / route, which would result in a clash in the browser. So we can only have one right here, which I'll name homepage. And now within this root, we want to create another file, which I'll call layout.tsx. You want to call rafce, and I'll do the same thing that we have done with the auth layout, but this time I'll call it root layout. I will destructure the children and specify that children are of a type React node. Make sure to import it at the top. And I'll return the children right here so we can render all of those pages. The final file and folder structure should look something like this. So if you head back into the browser, you should be able to see the home page on the / route. But if you head over to sign-in or sign up, you should be able to see two different pages. And the reason why you don't see something like auth /sign-in is because we used a route group. Feel free to try to create a couple of routes on your own and test out the Next.js's file-based routing functionality. And in the next lesson, we can start right away with developing our auth pages. So let's get started with working on the first page of our great PrepWise application. It'll be the auth page, but since we're starting from scratch, it's best to first set up our entire design system, because even though the pages are different, they share some similarities, like this background header that we have across all pages, or maybe the spacing in between the elements, or different colors that repeat across the application. So the best place to define all of these differences is within a globals.css file. So if you head over to your application, you'll notice that we currently have a globals.css here generated by chatcn. But we actually want to remove that one and instead get the one right here from the public. Drag it and drop it to the app folder. You'll notice that this one has the same chatcn setup that the previous one had. I copied some of the color codes from the Figma design, where we have the success, destructive, primary colors, light colors, and dark colors, as well as we're importing some of the background images right here. Down below, you'll notice this theme inline, which is used to define anything related to the application, such as custom fonts, font families, background images, shadows, and more. And if you scroll even further, you'll notice something known as a layer base. This layer base is used for resetting and normalizing styles. For example, maybe you want to apply this outline to every single element, or apply a background to a body, or make every single p tag have the color of text line 100, make the headings large and semi-bold, and so on. After that, there's a layer of components, where you can define some reusable component level styles, such as a button for calling, disconnecting, uploading, primary buttons, secondary buttons, cards, and so on. And finally, we have the utilities. So if you scroll down right here, you'll see that we are applying a utility such as a dark gradient or a pattern, which simply applies this background. What we're doing here is coming up with a nice system that allow us to make these classes reusable. So within JSX, we can just say blue gradient dark, and it'll automatically apply this set of Tailwind CSS classes. I won't be covering all of the Tailwind CSS in this video, as it's not the main focus and it definitely goes beyond the scope. But if you want to dive deeper into Tailwind and create all of these classes on your own, as well as learn how to make the most out of Tailwind's features with tips and tricks, right below I'll link our Tailwind CSS crash course, available completely for free on JS Mastery Pro. And you'll even have access to a complete transcript, as well as the quizzes below each lesson to check your knowledge. But with that said, to put our styles to use, let's start with adding a common background pattern to the entire body. We can do that by heading over into our layout.tsx, and to the entire body, we can apply a class name of pattern. Now, you might be wondering where this pattern is coming from and how the heck is my WebStorm so smart that it automatically knows what I want to apply. Well, if you search for it, you'll find it right here within the globals.css. So as soon as you apply it, you'll need to open up a second terminal and run npm install tailwind css-animate and press enter. And if you head to your browser, you should be able to see this subtle but nice background with some stars, as well as a grid of boxes appearing right here. At this point, it might be a good idea to put my browser side by side with my editor so we can see the changes that we're making live. There we go, looking good. Now let's create this as a new component which we can reuse across different pages. I'll create a new folder in the root of the directory, and I'll call it components. Within components, create a new file and call it authform.tsx and run rafce. Now we can import this auth form in both the sign up and the sign in pages. So right here in sign in, instead of returning a div, let's simply return a single auth form. Make sure to import it at the top and pass in a prop of type equal to sign in. We'll use this prop to differentiate how this component shows on either one of these two pages. And the same thing happens for the sign up. You'll need to head over to the sign up page and just return, instead of the div, an auth form, but this time with a type equal to sign up. Now head over to the auth layout and let's give both of these pages a class name equal to auth-layout. If you open this auth layout within our globals.css, you'll notice that it's simply applying a property of flex, centering the items both vertically and horizontally, as well as applying different media query properties to make sure that this looks good on all devices. Now we'll need to install some Chatcn components like the form, buttons, and inputs, just so we can more easily create this form. I'll do that by opening a new terminal. To install these components, just type npx chatcn add latest, add, and then add a button, form, input, and sonar, and press enter. It'll ask you whether you want to proceed with the use force or use legacy peer depths. We'll go for the legacy peer depths and repeat that from now until the end of the project. Now, you know what a button is, right? But what the heck is a sonar? Well, this is an opinionated toast component for React. It looks something like this, and it is super simple to use. So now that we have the needed components, let's code out the auth form and make it work for both the sign in and sign up pages. I'll head over into components, auth form, and I'll start by replicating what Chatcn suggests for creating new forms. It'll look something like this. So head over to Chatcn and click on a form. It'll say that the forms are tricky. Actually, they're one of the most common things you'll build in a web application, but also one of the most complex. So let's follow their guide. First, we have to add it, which we have already done, and then we have to create a new schema using Zod. So let's copy this first step and let's paste it right here at the top. You'll notice immediately that we use the use client directive at the top because in Next.js, as soon as you use some client-side functionalities like button clicks, inputs, or forms, that is typically a client render component, so you have to add this directive at the top. And then here, we define the schema. Right now, it only has the username. That is a Chatcn example. So let's head to the second part where we define the form. I'll actually copy these two additional imports, which we're now adding on top of Zod, such as React hook form and Zod resolver. And we're defining the form as well as our submit handler. So let's copy those two and let's put them at the top of our auth form. It'll look something like this. After that, we have to build our actual form by importing all of the Chatcn components that the form will be comprised of. So let me add them right here at the top as well. And finally, we have to define the actual form within JSX. So let me copy it and let me paste it right here within this div where I can define the form. Great. And that's it. You should have something that looks like this. And if we head over into localhost 3000 to /sign in or sign up, you should be able to see that everything is centered because we have used that layout, which centers both the sign in and the sign up. And now we have this simple input right here in the middle. Of course, we'll modify it just a tiny bit to look more like this. So let's start with the UI first. I'll give this div a class name equal to card-border, and on large devices, a minimum width of 566 pixels. I found that value to work the best. Within it, I'll create another div that'll have a class name equal to flex-call, and a gap of 6 with a property of card, padding Y of 14, and padding X of 10. This will create a card-like div at the top. Next, within that div, I will create another div that'll have a class name equal to flex-row, gap of 2, and justify center, which we will use as the container for our image. So right here, I will declare a new Next.js image. So make sure to import it from next/image with a source of /logo.svg, an alt tag of logo, a height of 32, and a width of 38. If you save it, you should be able to see our PrepWise logo, but let's also apply a text, an H2 that'll say PrepWise, or think of your own application name, save it, and give it a class name of text-primary-100. Perfect. Already looking so much better. Also, now I'm noticing that it's possible that my ESLint and Prettier are not doing their job because this line could have been split into multiple lines to make it more readable. So I'll press Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P on Windows, and I will type ESLint and go into Settings. Here, instead of making it disabled, I'll select the manual ESLint configuration and select the package right here from our node modules. Same thing for the configuration file. It should find it automatically. If you're on a different code editor, it's possible that the setup will look a bit different, or maybe ESLint was working for you the entire time. So I'll click OK, and I'll do the same thing for Prettier. In this case, I'll say automatic Prettier configuration. We'll see later on whether this is actually applying the ESLint properties or not, but for now, we're more than good. Right below the div that's containing the logo and the image, let's create an H3 that'll say practice job interviews with AI. There we go. Now we have a tagline as well. And right below that H3, we have a form. Let's just make sure that this div actually gets closed after the form. So the form will be a part of this initial div. So I'll scroll down and I'll paste the div right here. And we'll have to indent the form properly so it fits right next to this H3. Great. This is looking much better. Now to our form, let's provide a class name of w-full. So it takes the full width of the screen, space-y-6 to create some inner space between different inputs, a margin top of 4 to create some space, and a class name of form. Within it, I don't want to have any form fields for now because as you can see, just a single form field takes a lot of space right here. So instead, we want to turn it into a reusable component because we're surely going to have more than just a single input. So I will copy this entire form field, delete it from here, and create a new common component called formField.tsx, within which I will run RAFCE. And for now, I will just paste it right here. And we can even do it as an immediate return, meaning just wrap it in parentheses instead of curly braces, where we have our form field. We're going to modify this component further to make it work across all inputs. So don't worry about the fact that it has some errors right now. We'll get back to it. For now, just to know which inputs we'll have later, I'll create different p tags. So we need to ask for the user's name, right? So I'll create a p tag of something like name. But we only want to display that name if we're on the sign up page and not on the sign in, because then we just want to go for the email. So to be able to conditionally render different fields, we'll use that auth form type that we're passing through prompts. Remember, on the sign in page, when we try to call it, we're providing a type, sign in or sign up. So that means that we can destructure it right here. Type will be equal to of a type is form type. And now, before we return JSX, I can say const is sign in, and it'll be equal to if type is triple equal to sign in. So here we just get a Boolean variable is sign in. Now, right here, we can only render a name if it's not sign in. So if it's sign up. So if not is sign in, then render the name. So now you can see that we don't see it on the sign in, but if we go to sign up, we'll be able to see that we'll soon have a name input. Below the name, let's also render a p tag for the email. And below it, let's render another for the password. Great. Below it all, we'll have a button that'll have a class name equal to btn. And it's going to say a different thing depending on which form we're on. So if is sign in, then it'll say sign in, else it'll say create an account. There we go. This is looking great. Now let's head below the form, below this form element, and let's create another p tag that will allow us to switch between the two pages. I'll give this p tag a class name of text-center, and I'll say if is sign in, then the text will say no account yet. Like, what are you doing? Else it'll say something like have an account already. And then depending on that, we can render a link coming from next link that'll have an href, which if it's not sign in, so not sign in, then we will point the user to /sign in, else we'll point them to /sign up. And we can also give to this link a class name of font-bold, text-user-primary, as well as a margin left of 1. And right within this link, I will say if not is sign in, then the link can say something like, hey, sign in, else it can say something like sign up. So it all looks like this. Now we're on the sign up page, and now we're in the sign in. And we can switch between the two, showing the same UI, which is because of the layout that we have. And then we can either show or not show the name input, as well as change the text on the button and the text on the bottom. Now, of course, for the form to be functional, we have to define what properties will it accept. So we have to fix this part that we copied over from ShadCN. First, above the form, I will create a new function, const auth form schema, which will be equal to a function that takes in the type of a type form type, and then it returns the type z.object, similar to what we had here, only for the username. But now I'll remove this form schema and we'll make this one dynamic. So I'll return a z.object that'll have a name, and a name will depend on the type that we have. So if the type is triple equal to sign dash up, well, in that case, it'll be a z.string dot min of 3 characters. Else, it'll be a z.string dot optional, because we don't really need it on the sign in. After the name, we'll also have the email, which will be a z.string dot email, so we can fully validate it. We'll also have a password, which will be a z.string dot min of, let's do 3 characters. Not as secure, I know, but we can bump it up later on. And that's looking good to me. And these are all the fields that we'll have. Now you can immediately see that we have an error because we have removed the previous form schema, but now we have this dynamic one. So right here within our application, at the top, we can say const form schema is equal to auth form schema, to which we have to pass the type of the form. And then it'll automatically understand it. And with that, we're up and running again. Next, when we're defining the form, we have to define the default values. And we don't have a username anymore, but this time we'll have a name of an empty string. We'll also have an email, which is an empty string, and a password, which is an empty string. And finally, on submit, we have a submit handler where we actually want to do something with the data that we have. So I'll open up a try and catch block. In the catch, we get access to an error, in which case I can simply console log the error that we're getting, as well as display a toast So I can say toast.error, and it'll say something like, there was an error, and we can then display the error message like this. And this toast, we can import from Sonar. So let's just try to automatically get it. Toast, coming right here from Sonar. And we can remove all of these other imports because we have extracted them into a new input component, which we'll create soon. For now, we want to keep this file clean. Now, what if we don't fail, if something goes right? Well, then we can check if the type is triple equal to sign up. In that case, we can just console log and say sign up, and then we can render all the values that we're getting from the form. Similarly, else, if it's sign in, we can also console log. This time we'll say sign in, but the values will be different. This time they will not contain the name. Great. And this is enough for our auth form for now. It's looking good, but we're missing the form field. So we're going to do that just after we enable these toasts. Now, you most likely wondered, like, Adrian, what is this Sonar thing? I haven't seen it before. It is either called the toast or an alert or something like that. Well, Sonar Toast is the new version of Toast from ShadCN, and it's actually super simple to use. The only thing we have to do to make it work is head over to our first layout, which we have created, where we have the body, and then right below the children, render a self-closing toaster component, which we can import from Sonar. And just like that, you should be able to trigger all the different toasts, error or success. So now that the toasts have been set up and we have a pretty nice looking sign up and sign in page, let's actually allow the users to start typing in some values. We can do that through the form field component, which we started creating. This one right here. But we'll make it super reusable. Instead of passing a control functionality to the form field, we'll actually use a React hook form controller. Let me show you what I mean. I will return a component called controller coming from React hook form. To it, I'll pass the name equal to the name of this input, which will come through props. I'll also pass the control itself, which will allow us to control this form field. And then I'll pass the render functionality, which is a callback function within which we can access the elements of the field, and then we can automatically return the rest of the input, which in this case is just this form item, which we copied from the ShadCN documentation. This just allows us to make this component so much more reusable. There we go, and I'll put it in a couple of lines just so it's a bit easier to see. So obviously to this form field, we have to pass a couple of props, which we can destructure right here. I'll pass the control, the name, the label, the placeholder, as well as the type, which by default can be set to text. And all of these will be of a type form field props with a generic T parameter that allows us to actually make it reusable. So let's define the interface of these form field props right here at the top by saying interface form field props that accepts a generic T parameter which extends one of the field values, and then we can define the other props we're getting. What this means is that it can have maybe a name, or it can be a value, it can be something else. Whatever we dynamically pass to it, it'll take the form of this generic T parameter. And the field values have to be imported from React hook form. So what else do we have here? We have the control, which will take in this T parameter, the name, which will take in a path with a T parameter. Make sure to also import the control coming from React hook form. We also have the label of a type string, as well as a placeholder, which is optional, of a type string, and a type, which is optional, either of a type text, or maybe email, or password, or maybe later on something like a file. And now that we have defined all of these prompts, let's actually make sure to check what we're returning. We have a controller with its control, the name, and the rendering. We are rendering a form item within which we have a form label, to which we can give a class name of label. And what is it rendering? For now, a static text of username. So you know what? Let's actually render the form field just so we can see how it looks like. I'll head back to our auth form component. And here where we have just fake texts, we can render actual form fields. So let's do it instead of the name. I will render a form field coming from components form field, not add/components UI form, because this is from Chatcn. This is our updated form field. You can immediately see that we can pass the form.control to it. We can pass the name. In this case, it'll be name. Label will be name as well. And we can pass a placeholder equal to your name, as well as a type of text. Or no, that's the default value, so we don't even have to pass it. And I'll make sure to nicely spread all of these props into a new line so we can see it very easily. Great. Now you can immediately see that we have an issue with a form field controller. And the issue is happening because I didn't close this component properly, but now we're good. So now you can see this nice username Chatcn input, but it's not taking in any of the props that we're passing into this form field. And if we create two new ones right here at the bottom, one for the email and one for the password, we can also immediately pass different props to it, such as for this email one, the name will be email, the label will be set to email as well, and the placeholder will be equal to your email address with a type equal to email. And for the password, we can set the name to password, the label to password as well, and the placeholder to something like enter your password with a type is equal to password. If we save it right now, we're just going to get 3 of the same old looking inputs. So why have we even created this separate component? Well, because we can put these props to use to very easily make it fully reusable. Let me show you. Instead of saying username here, let's just render a dynamic label, which changes the name, email, and password. Within the form control and the input, pass it a class name equal to input, and immediately it changes to our look and feel. To it, we can pass the placeholder, which can now be dynamic. So it'll say your name, your email address, and your password. Below it, we're spreading the properties of the field, and I think we're good for now. We don't actually need this form description, as it just clutters the view, and we can leave the form message at the bottom. And check this out. We have our sign up form, and if you switch over to sign in, we get rid of the name input. Looking great. Let's see if there's some final changes we have to make to the auth form. Now that we have the form fields, what do we have to do with the functionality? Well, instead of just console logging the fields right here, what do you say if we showed a success toast message, as well as redirected the user to the right place? So let me get access to the router by using the Next.js use router hook. Make sure to import it from Next Navigation and not Next Router. And then right here, instead of this console log, I'll render a toast.success account created successfully. Please sign in. And I will render a router.push pointing to /sign in. Similarly, for the sign in, I will say toast success, signed in successfully, and we'll push over to the homepage, just /. So if you've done that correctly, we should have a proper UI as well as the functionality to switch between those two routes. And checking it out on the desktop, it's looking even better. We have complete validation right here for all the fields. So if you start typing and it's not matching the validation, it won't actually allow you to go to the next field or submit the form. But if you type everything correctly, Adrian, contact @jsmastery.pro with some kind of a password. Oops, this is a big mistake. We don't want this to happen. Thankfully, you weren't able to see my real password as I was just typing this dummy one. Or is this my real password in the first place? Who knows? We have to head over to our form field and pass the type equal to this input, which will apply a type of password, which will then hide the characters within the password. So let's just click create an account. Account created successfully. Please sign in. And we were successfully redirected. This means that the UI of our auth pages is now complete. And if we try to sign in, I'll once again enter my fake password. From sign in, we get redirected to the homepage. So it would make the most sense to start developing the homepage next. But you know what? I like this project so much, and it'll end up being a bigger one for sure. So I wanted to make it even easier for you to follow along and not get stuck by immediately creating a GitHub repo for this project and then committing the changes for each commit separately, which will allow you to look at the state of the codebase at different points in time. That's the level of detail that we put into our courses on JS Mastery Pro, specifically on the Ultimate Next.js course, where each lesson, no matter how small it is, has its own GitHub commit, so you can see the exact changes I made there and then. So as a little treat to you, let's do it on this project as well. I'll head over to GitHub and create a new repo, which I'll call AI mock interviews, and create it. We'll have to follow the setup to push the code we have created so far. So within my second terminal, I'll clear it and type git init, git add dot, git commit -m, setup app, file and folder structure, routing, and auth pages. Git branch -m, git remote add origin, and git push u origin main. In just a second, it'll be pushed over to GitHub. And now if you head over to commits, you'll be able to see that we started from the initial commit from Next.js app. And if you click on it and click browse files, you can basically browse the repository at that point in time, or just see all the changes that we made up to that point. Same thing here. If you go to the second one, you can see all of the files that we have added up to this point in the codebase. And as I said, I got this idea from the Ultimate Next.js course, where right now we just recently hit over 100 commits, one for each lesson of the course, where you can see exactly what is happening in the codebase. Pretty cool, right? So from now on, I will try to stay consistent and do one commit per lesson, moving on to the next lesson where we'll implement the homepage. To start developing our homepage, we'll first need our navbar that will be repeated across all the other pages. Our navbar is super simple. It's basically just a logo on the top. So head over into our layout within the root, this one right here, and let's create a simple navbar by wrapping everything in a div, and give this div a class name equal to root-layout. Right within it, create a new HTML5 nav element, and within the nav, create a new link component coming from next link, and give it an href pointing to a /, meaning the homepage, alongside a class name of flex, items-center, as well as a gap of 2. And within this link, we can render a new image, which we can import from next image, give it a source of /logo.svg, with an alt tag of logo, and a width of 38 with a height of something like 32 because it has more width than it has height. And there we go. We have a pretty simple logo right here on the top left. And below the image, we can render an h2 that'll have a class name equal to text-primary-100, and it'll say something like prepwise. There we go. Looking good. And right below the link and the nav, we can render the children. So now we have the homepage and always the logo on the top. So let's create the initial UI of the homepage by heading over to root page.tsx. First things first, I'll wrap everything in an empty React fragment, which looks something like this, and then I will render a section right within it. This section will have a class name equal to card CTA, so call to action. And within this section, I'll create a div that'll have a class name equal to flex, flex-call, a gap of 6, and a max W of LG. So we give it a max width so it doesn't extend more than, let's see how much it is, more than 500 pixels. So within it, let's render an H2 and say something like get interview ready with AI powered practice and feedback. There we go. And below it, we can render a p tag with a class name of text-lg, within which we can render a text that says practice on real interview questions and get instant feedback, something like that. Right below it, we can render a button. This will be a button coming from UI components button, which means chat.cn. Let's give it the as child property, which means that the whole button will take the property of a child, which will be a link since it's going to be clickable. And let's give it a class name of btn-primary max-small w full. So on smaller devices, we're going to make it take full width. And within it, we can render a link coming from next link with an href pointing to /interview. And it can say start an interview. So if we save it, this is looking pretty good, takes the full width on mobile devices. Now we can go below the button and below this div that's wrapping the button, but still remaining within the same section. And here we can render an image with a source of /robot.png, alt tag of robo dude or something like that, and a width of 400 and a height of 400 as well, with a class name of max small devices hidden. So we don't have a lot of space to show it on smaller devices, but on large devices, we can show this robo dude, letting us know that we can prep our interviews on JavaScript, PHP, CSS, HTML, whatever it is. Now, right below this section, we can open up another section that'll have a class name of flex-call, gap of 6, and a margin top of 8. And within it, we can render an h2 that'll say your interviews. And below it, we can render a div that'll have a class name of interviews-section, within which we can render a p tag that'll say something like you haven't taken any interviews yet. And we can save it. There we go. You haven't taken any interviews yet. Typically, you need to escape any kind of apostrophes. You can do that by copying this part. It's an and sign, apos, and then a semicolon. And then we can go below this section and create another section that'll have a class name equal to flex-call, a gap of 6, and a margin top of 8. And within it, we can render an h2 that'll this time say take an interview. And below it, we can render a div that'll have a class name equal to interviews section. And within it, we can render a p tag that can say there are no interviews available. There we go. So now we have two different subheadings for different sections. Later on, we can show different interviews that other people have taken or our own interviews right here on the top. Now, each one of these will be an interview card, and an interview card will have to show the rating if we have already taken the interview of the feedback we received. It'll show some kind of a fake photo of the company we're trying to interview for. Later on, you can make this fully functional and actually allow users to upload images to show for which company they're applying. And also, we can choose whether it's technical or behavioral, as well as show the description, technologies, and a button. First things first, let's focus on the date. We'll use a library called day.js to nicely parse the date. So just open up the terminal and run npm install day.js. And now we can display at least some dummy cards. Since we don't yet have the logic to actually create an interview, we'll take some fake data and then display it right here. If you head over to constants, index.ts, and scroll to the bottom, you'll see that we have commented out the entire file for now. But right here at the bottom, you can uncomment this part that says export const dummy interviews, where I created an array of two different objects. Each one has an ID, a user ID, a role, type, tech stack, level, questions, finalized or not, and created at date. So now, right here on our homepage, we can start mapping over those interviews right here under your interviews. So here we have a div with an interviews section, and we can just map over dummy interviews, which will automatically import it from constants. If it doesn't do that, make sure to manually import them right here at the top. And then we can say dot map we get each individual interview, and for each interview, we can return an interview card like this. So this is a component that we have to create. So let's head over to components and create a new interview card.tsx, run RAFCE, and make sure to import it right here, interview card coming from components. To this interview card, we can spread out the entire interview by saying ... interview. So you should be able to see two interview cards right here. And what we can do is we can also show these interviews by copying them right here under the second interview section by basically just copy and pasting the same thing. And this piece of text that we had, something like you haven't taken any interviews yet. Well, you know what? Let's leave that here because we might need to use it in a case when there's no interviews whatsoever, when a user joins for the first time. So I'll leave it here, but I'll leave it commented out. Okay, so with that said, let's head into the interview card and let's implement its UI given this data that we're passing into it. We are spreading all the data, so what we can do here is just destructure it. Let's see what do we have coming from constants. We have the ID, user ID, role, type, tech stack, and so on. So I'll actually just destructure all of them, starting from the interview ID, the user ID, the role, type, tech stack, and created at. And these are of a type interview card props. Now later on, we'll also be able to generate some kind of feedback for each interview card. So I'll say const feedback is equal to null as feedback or null. This is just to make TypeScript happy, but for now, we're basically saying that feedback is set to null. Also, when it comes to the type of the interview we have, this type can be a string of anything. So we have to normalize it to make sure that it looks good. So if someone says something like technical, we can just say technical. But if they say a mix of technical and behavioral, in that case, we can just say something like mixed. So to do that, we can say const normalized type is equal to mix GI. G is for global, I is for case insensitive. And we can say dot test on the type. If it matches, we just return mixed. So we shorten it to mixed, else we return whatever the type is, like either technical or behavioral. Great. And we have installed day.js. So let's actually put it to use. I'll say import day.js from day.js, and it'll allow us to format the date. So I'll say const formatted date is equal to day.js, to which we can pass the feedback, question mark dot created at, so the time we have gotten the feedback at, or created at, or date dot now if we don't have anything else. So take either one of these times and give me the date, and format it, so dot format MMM, so this is kind of a semi-long month, day, comma, and then give me a full year. This is how we can format it using the day.js library. Great. So now that we have this info and the props we're passing in, we can actually use it to display a card. If we reload, you'll see there's one issue right here, and that is that we need to pass a key into the interview card as well. Thankfully, Next.js explains what we have to do very clearly here. So we can pass a key equal to interview.id, and make sure to do it both times when we're calling it right here, interview.id. There we go. No more errors, and we can continue developing the interview card. Starting off with a div that's wrapping everything, I'll give it a class name of card-border with a W of 360 pixels. This is for the width of the card, and the max small device W full. So on smaller devices, they'll take the full width, and the height will be set to min h of 96. There we go. So now we have these different interview cards. Within this div, I'll render another div that'll have a class name of card-interview. And within it, I'll render another div. And within that div, I will render yet another div that'll render a p tag with a class name of badge-text, and it'll render the normalized type. So if I save it, it'll say technical, and the second one will say mixed. To this div, we can give a class name equal to absolute top-0, right-0, w-fit, padding x of 4, padding y of 2, and the rounded-bl lg, so this is for the border, and we can give it a bg light of 400. Or you know what, I think 600 might look better. There we go. So we have just absolutely positioned this badge, either technical or mixed. Now we can head below this div that is wrapping the p tag, and we can create an image. This image will have a source of get random interview cover and call it as the alt tag pass the cover image. Also give it a width of about 90, a height of about 90, and a class name equal to rounded-full, as we typically do with those profile photos, object-fit, and a size of 90 pixels. If you do that and properly close the image, while making sure that you import it from next image, and then if you head over into this get random interview cover function by command clicking into it, I can show you how it works. It basically gets the random index of however many interview covers we have, and then it chooses a random cover out of the bunch. And if you look into what those interview covers are, well, they're coming from constants. So if you go to constants and search for interview covers, you'll have to uncomment them as well. So this is basically just an array of different paths to the images in our public folder. And we also need something known as mappings, and mappings map out different technologies to, once again, different paths to images in our application. I actually also just took this over from our Ultimate Next.js course, because there we also have tags with different technologies, like GraphQL goes to /GraphQL, TS is TypeScript, JS is JavaScript, and so on. So we have paths pointing to all of those different technologies so we can nicely show them. I'll explain this soon, but what matters most for now is that we're now getting an image or a logo of a company that we are interviewing with. Of course, right now, this is just static data, or should I just say fake dynamic? Because if you reload, you're going to get different pairs of logos. But later on, if you want to, once we implement a database, you could actually allow users to choose which company they're interviewing for and then submit this image for each specific card. For now, this is more than good enough. But what do you say that we go ahead and display some date, and then later on display the actual technologies that you're going to be asked about in this interview? We can do that by heading below this image, and right below it, rendering an H3 that'll have a class name equal to margin top of 5 and capitalize. Within it, we can say something like role and then interview, which in this case will render front-end developer and full-stack developer interview. Below this H3, we can render a div that'll have a class name of flex, flex-row, a gap of 5, and a margin top of 3. And within it, we can render another div that'll have a class name equal to flex, flex-row, a gap of 2. And within it, we can show some kind of an image that'll just render the logo or the icon of a calendar. So let's go to calendar.svg. An alt tag will be calendar, width will be equal to 22 pixels, and the height will be equal to 22 as well. So if I save it, we'll see a little calendar icon right here. And right below it, we can render a p tag that'll simply render the formatted date. There we go, March 15th and March 14th. This date was a long time ago, so hopefully this person got the interview. So let's go below this p tag and let's render another div with a class name equal to flex, flex-row, gap of 2, and items-center. And within this div, let's render an image. Once again, very similar to the calendar, but this time it'll be a /star.svg with an alt tag of star, a width of 22, a height of 22, and we can close it right there. And below the image, we can render the p tag and render feedback total score. Or if a score doesn't exist, we can say --, and then outside of it, we can say out of 100. So now in this case, it'll say --, out of 100 because we haven't yet taken the interview. Now we can go 2 divs down and let's render a p tag where we can render a class name equal to line-clamp-2, which will fit the text into 2 lines, and a margin top of 5. And here we can render the feedback !final assessment. So if we have taken the interview, we can show the feedback right here. Or if we haven't, we can say you haven't taken the interview yet. Take it now to improve your skills. There we go. So now we have a description as well. We can now go below this p tag and below the div and render a div within which we'll map over our tech icons. So let's give it a class name of flex, flex-row, and justify dash between. And let's render a p tag that'll say tech icons. And right below, we can render a button with a class name equal to btn primary, a link, which you have to import from next link, with an href. If a feedback exists, then we want to take the user over to the feedback results page. So it'll be /interview /interview ID /feedback. Else, if a feedback doesn't exist, we'll just take the user to /interview /interview ID so they can just take it for the first time. And we can close this link here. And within it, if there is feedback, we'll say check feedback. Else, we'll say view interview. There we go. So now we have this button as well. And the last remaining thing is for us to render the tech icons that this interview is all about. So to render them, we'll have to create a utility function that'll map over those constants that I showed you not that long ago. You see, here we have the mappings, but now we have to create a utility function that allow us to map over the icons that this interview has something to do with, like React, TypeScript, Next.js, and Tailwind. And then it'll have to find the corresponding technologies in this map and get their icon. So let me show you how that function works. If you head over into your public folder, you'll see that here we have a utils.ts file. Copy its code and delete it. And we'll want to paste that code right here within lib utils.ts. Right there. You'll see that here we have that get random interview cover, which shouldn't really be here. Before, it was picking it out from my public folder. So if we head over into the interview card, we'll have to fix the import of the get random interview cover from public utils to lib /utils. There we go. And alongside this get random interview cover, we'll also have the get tech logos, which uses the tech array, which we pass into it. We then normalize the tech name by removing some lowercase characters, replace dots and spaces, and then we look into this map of different technologies, and if it's React.js or React.js or React, we still return the same React logo. And then we can generate that random icon from dev icons. This was a function that, of course, I used ChatGPT to generate. It's the perfect type of tedious work that ChatGPT does the best, but I think I wrote something pretty similar by hand in the Ultimate Next.js course. So now in the interview card, we can actually use that utility function, but to keep the code clean, I'll actually do it within a separate component. So I'll head over into components and create a new component called display tech icons.tsx, run rafce, and it'll work like this. The only thing that it'll take in is going to be the tech stack. and this is of a type tech icon props. So what we can do for now is maybe just display the tech stack. Okay, so let's actually import this display tech icons instead of this p tag. So that'll be display tech icons. And as the tech stack, we can provide the tech stack coming from the props into the interview card component. If you do that, you'll see a list of different technology names, such as React, TypeScript, Next.js, Tailwind, CSS, and so on. And it's going to be different for each one of these cards. So what we'll have to do next is actually map over them. So let's render them in a div with a class name of flex and flex-row. And instead of icons, let's try to get the logos by saying const tech icons is equal to await. And if we're using await, we have to turn this into an async function, and then call the get tech logos utility function, to which we have to pass that tech stack that we used. So how does the get tech logos work? Well, we map over the array, we normalize the tech name, and then we call the CDN that delivers those icons on dev icon or devicon, and then it just returns the actual URLs. So now if we render tech icons instead of tech stack, you'll see that it cannot display that because it's an object. So instead, let's just say tech icons dot slice from 0 to 3. So we're going to show 4 different icons. And we're going to say dot map. And for each one of these icons, let's destructure the tech and the URL. And for each one of these, we can also get the index and return a div. This div will have a class name equal to relative group and bg dark of 300 with a rounded full, a padding of 2, and flex-center. And within it, we can render a span that'll have a class name equal to tech tooltip, and it'll render the tech. So now you can see what appears to be 3 different divs, but we cannot see the tech icons as of yet because each child should have a key. Well, that's not breaking it, but yeah, it's right. So let's provide a key to this div equal to tech. And below the span, let's render an image. Make sure to import it from next image. Give it a source equal to the URL of that tech icon, an alt tag of tech, a width of 100, a height of 100, and a class name equal to size of 5. If you do that, you'll see 3 different icons appear right here and even a tooltip. So when you hover, you know exactly what tech that is. Pretty cool, right? We came from an array of random technology names to technology icons by creating a utility function that maps over the technologies, normalizes the name so that it replaces dots or spaces to just regular names, and then we call the URL that delivers those images. Let me show you how that looks. Dev icon. Here you have all sorts of different technology icons. Check this out. There's literally any developer icon you can think of. HTML, CSS, React, you name it, it's there. And you can call it just by making a URL call. Now, if there's multiple icons, let's make them overlap a bit so it looks better. So for this class name, I'll actually make it dynamic. And I'll call a CN property coming from utils. This is from chat-cn, which allows you to pass a pre-built string, but then also provide a dynamic style, such as if index is greater than or equal to 1, then we can render the minus margin left of 3, which will kind of push them together. There we go. So they kind of overlap, but we can still see what they're about. And that's it for these display tech icons, which we're now rendering alongside the interview card. So now if you explore this in its full glory on the desktop, we have this great looking banner that will soon allow you to take an interview. And then we have developed an interview card, which shows you the type, whether you have taken it or not yet, what the feedback is, the description, as well as some technology icons and a call to action button that allows you to either view the interview or view the feedback of the interview you have taken. So now that we have built out the UI of the homepage and we have created these fake cards, what do you say that we go ahead and implement the real logic and functionality for all the UI that we have implemented so far? That'll include the storage for interviews, as well as authentication for our sign-in and sign-up pages. So let's do that next. Let's store our interviews and handle the authentication using Firebase. Firebase is a backend as a service tool offered by Google, providing authentication, databases, storage, and more without having to manage servers. It's widely used by startups, mid-sized companies, and even enterprises like New York Times, Duolingo, Gameloft, and Alibaba for rapid development. And there are two types of SDKs that Firebase offers. The admin SDK allows secure server-side operations, while the client SDK enables direct interactions from web or mobile apps. In the latest versions of Next.js, Firebase works with server actions and middleware for authentication, real-time database management, and edge functions for scalability. And that's exactly what you'll learn to do today by using both the admin and client SDKs of Firebase with server actions and more. So let's get started by creating an account on Firebase. Head over to firebase.google.com and open the Cloud Console using any Gmail account. Create a new project by getting started and give it a name. I'll go with something like PrepWise. Confirm and continue. Sure, we can enable Gemini as well as Google Analytics. Why not? And you can choose your Google Analytics account and click Create Project. It'll take just a minute, so pause this video and I'll be right back. Next, click Continue. Then we can set up authentication. You can either click on it right here or go to Build and then Authentication right there. And then click Get Started and enable the email and password provider. If you want to, you can also turn on the email link for passwordless login. For now, I'll leave it off and click Save. Great, email and password enabled. Now, back in our project overview, you can head over to Build and then Database. Here, you'll need to create a new database, leave the database ID to default, and choose the location that is closest to your region. And click Next. Select Start in Production Mode and click Create. Let's wait until it is provisioned and then head over back to the project overview and click this web icon, the third one on the list. Here, you'll have to provide the web app name. I'll just say web and click register. Now, it'll give you a command you can use to install Firebase within our application. So let's copy it, npm install Firebase. You can paste it right here within your second terminal. And while it is installing, also copy the file contents as they are and put them within a new file, which we can put within a new folder called Firebase. And within Firebase, let's create a new file called client.ts. And right here, we can paste the code that we just copied. After that, you can click Continue to Console, click on this settings icon right here, and head over to Project Settings and navigate to Service Accounts. Here, you'll have to generate a new private key. So just generate it, and this will download a JSON file. From here, you'll want to take over the project ID, the private key, as well as the client email. So select those 4 lines, copy them, and then create a new .env file right here in the root of our application and call it .env.local. Paste what you copied, but we'll have to give it a bit of a different name. Let's start it with Firebase _project_ID and make it equal to what we just copied. We can do a similar thing with the private key, not the private key ID, we can remove that, but this one we can call the private key. So I'll say Firebase _private_key and make it equal to this. And finally, we have the Firebase client email, and I'll make it equal to this email right here. So now these are within our .env.local. You'll have different values. Now we'll want to add the Firebase admin SDK to our server. The admin SDK is a set of server libraries that lets you interact with Firebase from privileged environments to perform actions like queries and mutations on a Firebase data connection, read and write real-time database data with full admin privileges, or generate some auth tokens. Exactly what we want to do. So, to make it happen, we'll first want to install Firebase Admin. So, just follow what I'm doing. In the terminal, run npm install firebase-admin-save. And while it is installing, we can create a new file within the Firebase folder that is right here, and let's call it admin.ts. Within it, we'll want to initialize our application. So let's do just that. I'll say const init Firebase admin is equal to an arrow function that first tries to get access to Firebase applications by saying const apps is equal to get apps. And we have to import this right at the top by saying import the structure get apps from Firebase-admin /app. Once we get the apps, we can then check if there's no apps.length. And this basically means, and we're doing these checks so we don't initialize the Firebase admin more than once in development or in production. This ensures that only one instance of Firebase SDK is created. We don't need more. Within it, we can say initialize app. This is also coming from Firebase admin, so initialize app, which you call as a function, and you can provide some options, such as credential is equal to cert, as in certificate, which is also coming from Firebase-admin app. And to it, you need to provide some information about the project, such as the project ID, which is equal to the process.env.firebase project ID. We have the client email, which is equal to the process.env.firebase client email. And finally, and most importantly, private key, which is equal to process.env.firebase private key. And we want to run $.replace, where you want to replace some new lines. So // new line /g for global, and then replace it with a /n. This will make sure to get rid of all of the new lines that we don't need within this key. And here I misspelled the credential. And now that we're passing the proper keys and initializing our app, right at the bottom, we can return auth as get auth. And this is coming from Firebase admin /auth. And we can return the DB. So this is the DB functionality, which can be equal to get firestore, also coming from Firebase admin /firestore. There we go. We'll use that admin authentication for getting some user information from the server side and perform some operations later on. And most importantly, from this file, we have to export const both the auth and the DB, which is equal to init Firebase admin, because this is where we're getting those values from. Great. And similar to how we set up admin or server-side Firestore, let's also set up a client Firestore in case we'll need it somewhere. So head over to Firebase client.ts and see how we only have the default setup right here. What we need to do is have the complete setup. So right at the top, we need the same imports as before. So I'll say initialize app, get app, as well as get apps coming from Firebase app. We don't need the get analytics, and I can remove some of these comments here. I'll also import the get auth coming from Firebase auth, and I'll import the get firestore coming from Firebase /firestore. A lot of fires right here. Finally, we're ready to initialize it. So first, let's make a check. Let's check if there's no get apps.length. So if we haven't initialized it already, then go ahead and initialize the app with the following configuration. Else, just get the existing app like this. We can remove those analytics And finally, we are ready to export const the auth, which is equal to get auth, to which we pass the app. And we can do the same thing with the database functionality, export const db, which is equal to get firestore, to which we pass the app. So we are initializing both the admin functionalities that allow us to perform some mutations on the server side, because this is considered to be much more secure as we're making the calls from the server. And then here we're in the client, where we still have some permissions, but they're much more limited than the ones on the client. Still, in this case, we are initializing both, and in both, we are giving access to auth and database or storage functionalities, so we can use them later on. I know this seemed like a lot of random code that I pulled out of, somewhere, but if you dive deeper into the docs, you'll be able to find all the information on how to set it up. Google has a lot of products, so sometimes it can be hard to find exactly what you're looking for. But once you go through it a couple of times and you understand how to spin up those servers or authentication apps or storage apps, you can then very easily set it up on a new app. So now that we have set up our Firestore and FireAuth, in the next lesson, let's go ahead and hook it up to our Auth UI to make it functional. Firebase authentication allows users to sign in using many different methods, like email and password, like we're using right now, or also Google and Facebook authentication, or even custom tokens. So I created a quick graph to explain exactly how it works. First, a user tries to sign in with email, Google, or Facebook, which then reaches the client SDK on the front-end side, which then generates the ID token after authentication, which proves the user's identity. The admin SDK used in the backend side verifies the ID token and manages session-based authentication securely. So it issues a session cookie, which then the client SDK reads and authenticates the user. So the next time, if a user is already logged in, they just have to make an authenticator request. We send over the session cookie, we verify it, fetch user details, return user details, and then we bring it back to the client side. This is the exact flow I'll show you how to replicate using Firebase Auth. So to dive right into it, let's create a new file within our lib folder. And let's create a new folder within it actually, and let's call it actions. And within actions, create a new file called auth.action.ts. And here we'll want to create an action for the signup. So I'll say export async function sign up, which accepts the params of a type sign up params, and we open up a function block. If you want to check what params will pass into it, you can command click into it, which will lead you to the interface that we created, telling us that we're expecting a UID, a name, email, and password. And when it comes to the sign-in, we just need an email and an ID token. Great. So let me show you how to implement it. First of all, I noticed that I have two dots in the name right here. This was supposed to be just auth.action.ts. Second of all, whenever you're in an actions file, you have to turn it into a server rendered file by using the use server directive right at the top. Then, now that you know which params we're passing into it, we can destructure them so we can more easily retrieve them by saying const UID name email, and that is equal to params. So right below it, let's open up a try and catch block. In the catch, if there's an error, we can just console log it by saying console.error and say error creating a user, and then we can console log the actual error. Or in this case, it's the E, like this. We can also handle some Firebase specific errors to be a bit more precise by checking if error.code is triple equal to auth/email already exists. We have to spell it correctly, of course. So if an email already exists, we can return an object with a success of false and a message of this email is already in use. And of course, this is just the E, since that's how we call it here. And let's set the E of type any, just so we don't have to do proper TypeScript validation in this case. And below this if statement, we can return another error where success is set to false, and the message is just something like failed to create an account. So this is going to be the general error, but maybe we get a different one right here if a user already exists. Now, what do we do in the try? Well, in this case, we want to sign our user up. So let's say const user record. We first want to fetch the user to check whether they already exist. So we'll say user record is equal to await db, which we need to import from Firebase admin in this case, dot collection of users dot doc of UID dot get. Okay, so this is pretty self-explanatory. We're trying to fetch the user by heading into the users collection, getting a document with a specific ID, and then saying get. Next, we can check if user record dot exists. If that is the case, then we can simply return an object with a success of false because we cannot create a user, and a message of something like user already exists. Please sign in instead. Makes sense, right? But if a user doesn't exist already, we can say await db.collection of users dot document of UID dot set. And we want to set its name to name and email to email, just like this. So we're creating a new user. Now we want to head back to our auth form. So I pressed Command P, which I often use to just quickly get to different files without having to navigate by using the File Explorer. And right at the top, where we have the sign up here in the sign up if statement, we can destructure some values, such as name, email, and password, coming from the values of the form, like this. Then we can call a function provided to us by Firebase. It looks like this. Const user credentials is equal to the await call, and if we're using await, we have to make this function async, of create user with email and password. And this is coming from Firebase Auth. This registers a new user in Firebase Authentication, not Firestore database, using their email and password if the email is not already a user. So to it, we have to pass the auth, which we need to import from Firebase client in this case. We also need to pass the email of the user and its password. So that'll look something like this. So this is only concerned with authentication. It's actually authenticating a user. But then we actually want to sign the user up. So I'll say const result is equal to await sign up. And this is a function that we have created coming from actions, to which we have to pass the UID of user credential dot user dot UID. We also want to provide a name equal to name, and you can add an exclamation mark, letting TypeScript know that we will have a name. Email will be set to email, and password will be set to password. Finally, if there is no result.success, means something went wrong, in that case, we can show a toast.error. Make sure to import that toast from Sonner and render the result.message and return, meaning exit out of the function because something went wrong. Else, we'll still keep this success and the redirect. And this result is possibly undefined, so I'll add a question mark right here so we know that we actually get the value. Great. So now, after we register the users, we'll redirect them to the sign-in page where they can sign in with Firebase's sign in with email and password, not sign up this time. This method will then generate a token, which we'll send over to the server side and set a cookie. So let's create another server action right next to the sign up, which will generate that cookie. I'll say export async function, set session cookie, which will take in the ID token of a type string, and we can now store them in the cookies by using the next cookies. Const cookie store is equal to await cookies, and this is coming from next headers. And then we want to create a session cookie by saying const session cookie is equal to await auth, and this auth is coming from Firebase admin, but actually it's going to be at /Firebase admin. So I want to get it right here next to the DB. You have to be careful about these types of imports. Auth dot create session cookie, to which we need to pass the ID token as well as the duration of that token. So I'll say expires in, and I'll do it 60 times 60 times 24 times 7. This is 1 week, okay? 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 24 hours in a day for 7 days a week. This means that it'll expire in 1 week, and you have to multiply it by 1000 milliseconds. There we go. So now we're creating that session cookie. And finally, we have to set it to the cookie store. So let's say cookie store dot set a session where we have a session cookie. And you can provide some additional options, such as a max age of the cookie, which is going to be equal to, well, we have to use the same expires in number. So I'll paste it here. Or, you know what? I can form a new variable at the top and call it 1 week and then store it. And now this makes a much more sense. Expires in 1 week, and we use max age 1 week. Never use something called magic numbers, where you don't know what those numbers mean. Instead, you want to nicely explain what it does with a proper variable name or a comment. HTTP only will be set to true. We typically do that with authentication cookies. Secure will be set to process.env.nodenv is triple equal to production. Path will be set to a /, and the same site will be equal to lex. I think I got this straight from the documentation. And now in that same file, like we have the sign up functionality, we can also create a sign in functionality. So I'll say export async function, sign in, that'll accept params. This time only the email and the password. So that's sign in params. Here we can destructure those params of email and ID token and make it equal to params. We can open up a try and catch block, where in the catch we can console log the error, and we can also return an object with the success property of false and a message of failed to log into an account. And then in the try, we can try to get access to the user by saying const user record is equal to await auth, and make sure that this is auth from Firebase admin SDK. So be careful about where you're importing it from, because if it's from the client, you won't have access to this user. And then we can say auth.getUser by email, and we want to pass over the email of that user. And if there is no user record, in that case, we simply want to return a success of false and a message of user does not exist. Create an account instead. But if the user does exist, we simply want to await set session cookie with the ID token of that user. And this set session cookie is the function we have created our own not that long ago. So now we have these three very important functions: sign up, sign in, and set session cookie. So let's actually put them to use to perform a sign in after we create an account. I'll head back into the auth form. Here we had the sign up. So we want to head over into the else part of this login process, which is the sign in. In here, I'll first want to get access to the values from the form. So the email and the password, which is coming from the values. And then we'll want to sign in with that user by saying const user credential is equal to await sign in with email and password. And this is coming from Firebase Auth. So you can import it from Firebase. And this is coming from @firebase/auth. And to it, we have to pass the auth object itself, the email, and finally, the password. And this should give us back the user credentials, which we can then use to generate a short-lived authentication token by saying ID token is equal to await user credential dot user dot get ID token, just like this. And then we can check if there is no ID token, then we can render some kind of a toast with an error of sign in failed. And we can exit out of the function by having a return. Else, we're finally ready to await the sign in server action call, to which we pass an object containing an email and the ID token. And with that, we finally show a success and redirect the user to the homepage. Okay, wait, but why are we doing all this? We are doing the registration on the client side right here because we're using the create email and password from Firebase Auth. And then we're storing the user on the server side. Specifically right here on the sign up, we are adding it to a collection. And then once again, we're doing the sign in also on the client side. And then we're setting the token over on the server side right here, because this is within a server action. Can't we do all of that on the client side instead? Well, you can do it both ways. Completely client side or mix as we did. But if you have everything client side, it'll be less secure because this ID token will never head over to the server, which means that it can be stolen via XSS attacks if stored insecurely like in local storage. You also can't perform server-side checks like checking for roles or permissions. You only can do that on the server. It's super difficult to manage the sessions because tokens expire, require you to refresh them on the client side, and it isn't SSR friendly because Next.js server components like API routes won't work properly. On the other side, doing the server-side authentication makes it much more secure because nobody can steal your tokens. You trust the server because you control it. We have built a backend that will actually execute these calls. And overall, you have a better user experience with Next.js, and it's easier to fetch user roles and permissions. So managing the authentication on the server side is the recommended approach, and that's why it might feel a bit more complicated, but once you get it, it is the right way to do things. And that's exactly what I wanted to teach you. So what do you say that we go ahead and test the authentication by creating a new user, then signing in, and then showing that created user on the Firebase authentication and the Firestore interface, just to verify that everything works properly. But just before we do that, there's one check I want to make, and it is within the .env.local, where we have our environment variables. They may or may not start with opening and closing string signs, but what matters more is that there are no extra characters on each one of these lines. See, we copied this from somewhere, which is not typically what you should be doing. So if you head over to the end, you'll notice that we have a comma at the end right here. You must remove that comma, otherwise the key will not be correct. Same thing for this comma right here at the end. So make sure that you have no commas and that you enclose everything with an opening and closing string sign. That's one thing. The second thing is in the auth form, where we're currently importing the create users with email and password and sign in with email and password from the add Firebase auth, which is the local version of this Firebase file. But we want to get it from Firebase/auth, which is actually coming from the node module we installed. And the third thing I want to do before we go ahead and check out the functionality is right here within auth.actions.ts at the end of the sign up file, where we first check if a user record exists, and if it doesn't exist, we then create it. But what I forgot to do is to actually return an object saying, hey, success is true. You have successfully created an account. So let me show a message of account created successfully. Please sign in. There we go. So this is what I was missing. So now make sure to reload your application by pressing Command C to stop it from running and then npm run dev to rerun it. And if you head into your browser, enter your name, email, contact@jsmastery.pro, and the password. Let's see what happens. I'll create an account and we get the account created successfully. Please sign in. We can also now sign in by using the same email and password combination. So if I give that a shot, we says sign in successfully and we have been redirected to the homepage. Okay, this is great. No errors whatsoever, but have we actually created an authenticated user and have we stored it in the database? To check that, you can head over to your Firebase project overview and then go to build authentication and Firestore storage, or maybe you already have the project shortcuts at the top. So in the authentication, you can see that a new user has been created with this email through an email provider, and we have gotten this user ID. And if you head over to the Firestore database, you'll notice that a new user collection has been created. Within it, a single document with the following name and email, which is exactly what we wanted, which means that our authentication and storage now works. But let's protect the routes by adding the checks whether a user exists or not. Because right now, if we reload or if somebody tries to access the homepage without signing in first, well, they'll be able to see it. But we only want to show the homepage to authenticated users. So to make that work, let's head back into auth.actions.ts. I will collapse all of the functions we have so far, and I'll create another. Export async function get current user, which will return a promise that will be resolved in either a user or a null, depending on whether we can get the user. Within it, we want to get access to the cookie store. So I'll say const cookie store is equal to await cookies coming from next headers. Then I'll try to get a specific session cookie by saying const session cookie is cookie store dot get session and then question mark dot value. After we get it, we can then check if there is no session cookie. In that case, we want to return null because a user doesn't exist. But if a cookie does exist, we can open up a try and catch block. In the catch, we'll simply console log the error and we can return null because either the session is invalid or expired. And in the try block, we can actually try to decode the session to see whether we have a valid user. So I'll say const decoded claims, this is the name they use in the docs, is equal to await auth dot verify session cookie, to which you have to pass the session cookie. And the second parameter is you want to check whether it's revoked or not. So I'll pass true for checking whether we have revoked the session. After that, we want to get access to the user from the database by saying const user record is equal to await db dot collection of users dot document, which will try to get it by decoded claims dot uid. Okay, so we want to figure out who is this user that is currently logged in, and then we want to call the dot get on it. If there is no user record dot exists, we simply want to return null. But if a user does exist, then we'll return an object inside of which we'll spread the entire user record dot data, as well as pass the ID equal to user record dot ID. And I'll assign this return as user. So this return will be as user. So we always know what we can expect from this function. And look at this, WebStorm saved my ass by saying get current user. Actually here we're missing the capitalized U. So now we're good. Perfect. And now we can use this get current user to figure out whether a user has been authenticated. So I'll say export async function is authenticated. And here we can try to get access to the user by saying await get current user. And if it exists, we'll simply return a user? Or how do we figure out if we have a user, return a Boolean true, else return a Boolean false? So there's a neat little trick that you can do to convert a truthy or a falsy value to a Boolean variable, and it is to use a double exclamation mark. Okay, a bit weird, but let me explain. If you have an object that contains the user data, like this, name is Adrian. If you have that, and then if you apply a single exclamation mark to it, what you will get is, well, object is truthy, and you apply a not to it, so that becomes false. And then you once again call the exclamation mark on false, and you get to a Boolean true. Similarly, if you have no user, so if we have just an empty string, for example, here, if you call an exclamation mark on an empty string, you will get, well, false, and then you convert it to true, so you'll get true, and then call it one more time, not true, you'll get to false. So basically, by using this double exclamation mark, we can turn either the existence or non-existence of the user into a Boolean value. Great. So now let's head over into the root layout. So that is right here, app root layout. It is this one right here. And let's add a check to see whether a user has been authenticated or not. Right at the top, I will say const is user authenticated. And that'll be equal to await. And since we're using await, make sure to make the function async is authenticated, which you have to import from libactions. And then we can say if not is user authenticated, we can simply redirect by using the next navigation functionality to /sign in. Perfect. So now all the non-logged in users won't be able to see the homepage. And we want to do a similar thing in our auth, but exactly the opposite actually. So copy these two lines and head over into the auth layout. Here, we also want to check whether a user has already been authenticated. So I'll add the async right here. But once we check, we actually want to check if they have been authenticated. If so, they don't have to log in again, so we can automatically forward them over to the homepage. We can test this right now. Since we're logged in, if we head over into the sign in page, well, we should automatically be redirected back to the homepage. And that's exactly what happens, which means that everything is working. Great. This was a tough one. We implemented both the storage as well as authentication using Firebase and Firestore. So you deserve a bit of a break. In the next lesson, we can focus on the interview generation page. Even though this is not like a typical form that allows you to type in what kind of interview you want, you'll be able to do it through a voice interface. So we'll do that next. But before, let's not forget to commit this because we have completed a big lesson. So I will say git add dot git commit -m implement auth and storage and git push. This way, you'll be able to compare your code to mine if you get stuck at any point. Great work. As I mentioned in the end of the last lesson, we won't just have a simple form that'll allow you to choose your experience level, technology stack, and so on. Rather, we'll have a voice interface that'll generate the interview for us. So let's focus on creating the UI first. We can do it by creating a new route. So this route will be under app, root, and then we can create a new folder called interview. And within interview, we can create a new page, which I'll call a page.tsx. Within it, for now, just run rafce. So for now, you can manually navigate over to it by saying /interview. Oh, but make sure to rerun your application after we have actually pushed it to GitHub. So npm run dev, and then reload in the browser. Immediately, you should be able to see this new interview page that we just created. Within this page, we'll use a common component called the agent. Why are we going to have another component? Well, that's because we will reuse this agent part both for the interview creation screens as well as for taking the actual interview once it has been generated. So let's create a new component within the components folder, and let's call it agent.tsx. Within it, run RAFCE and import it within this interview page. We can wrap everything in an empty React fragment. And then we can render an H3 that'll say interview generation. There we go. And below it, we can render the agent component coming from components agent. And to it, we can pass the user name. For now, we can default it to something like you, the user ID equal to user1, and the type, which will be set to generate. Later on, as I said, we're going to have one type for taking the interview and one part for generating the interview. And now we can code out this agent component. Let's start with wrapping everything in a div that has a class name of call view. Within this div, we'll have another div for the interviewer card. So I'll give it a class name equal to card-interviewer. And within this div, I'll render another div that'll have a class name equal to avatar. And within the avatar, I'll have an image coming from next image with a source of /AI avatar.png, an alt tag of Vapi, because that's the actual voice powering the AI, the width of about 65, a height of about 54, and a class name equal to object-cover. If I save it, you should be able to see this profile photo right here. Now, we'll have to somehow figure out who is speaking. Is the interviewer speaking, or is the interviewee, or are we speaking? So we'll need some kind of a Boolean variable, const is speaking, and for start, we can make it equal to true. Later on, we can dynamically modify it, but for now, this is good. So below this image, I'll check whether we are currently speaking, and if that is the case, we'll render a self-closing span element with a class name of animate-speak. And you'll see that now it'll start pulsing in this circle-like way. So if you actually hover over it, or if you search for this CSS property, you'll see that it's applying the animate ping property from Tailwind CSS, which is pretty cool on its own. And we just have to apply a color and the opacity. And that's it. Tailwind does the most of the work by using the animate ping property behind the scenes. And we can also render an H3 below this div that'll say AI interviewer. There we go. And now we can do a very similar thing for the second card. So we're gonna go one div down, and I'll create another div for our profile card that'll have a class name of card-border. And within it, we'll have another div that'll have a class name equal to card-content. And within it, we can render an image with a source of /user-avatar.png, as well as an alt tag of user avatar, a width of about 540 pixels, and a height of about 540 as well. If you save it, you won't be able to see it yet. So I'll also provide a class name equal to rounded-full, object-cover, and a size of 120 pixels. And below this image, I will render an H3 that'll simply render our current user name. So where is this username coming from? Well, we passed it over through props. So I will destructure it right here, user name, and it'll be of a type agent props. There we go. Let's make sure that we have positioned all of our divs properly. I will first wrap everything in an empty React fragment, and I will move everything we have right now within that React fragment. So it'll look something like this. So we have the call view, we have the card interviewer, and we have the avatar containing this image. And then we close that image, and we render an H3, below which we close this inner card interviewer div, and we open up a new div, card border, with a div with the card content, where we render the image and an H3. And then we close 1, 2, 3 divs. This is looking good. So if you head over to desktop, you'll see that we have both the AI interviewer card as well as you right here on the right. But as you start collapsing it, you'll notice that once we don't have enough space to show both cards, we only show the AI interviewer. That matters more, and it leaves us some additional space to show some things right here at the bottom. So let's go below these three divs and let's render another div that'll have a class name equal to wfull flex justify dash center. And within that div, we can check for the call status. Okay, so bear with me. Every call has a couple of statuses, which we have to define. So let me create an object at the top, or this is a perfect case for creating an enum. Enum of call status allows us to define multiple values, such as an inactive state, which I can set to inactive, or maybe we can do connecting state equal to connecting. Also, a status can be active equal to active, or it can be finished. So now we have all of those cases or call statuses. Now within here, we can check whether the call status is not active. And if that is the case, then we can return a button that will allow us to commence the call. This button will render a span, and within that span, we can check for the call status. So if the call status is triple equal to inactive, or if the call status is triple equal to finished, in that case, we want to make it say call, else we want to just make it say ... like the call is still going on. Else, if the status is not active, we can then go right here and just render a button that'll have a class name equal to btn-disconnect, and it can simply say end. So right now you can see this end button, but let's try to change the status to something like maybe finished. So if we change it to finished, we now have to style this call button a bit further. So let's do that by heading into this button and giving it a class name equal to relative and btn call. That's much better. And let's also style the span within it by giving it a class name equal to, let's make a dynamic of cn absolute animate dash ping rounded dash full and opacity of 75. And only if the call status is not equal to connecting, and then we can give it a class name of hidden. Don't worry about these squiggly lines. That's because we have currently always set the state to active, but actually, it'll change later on depending on the state of the call. And I made a small mistake here. This span right here has to be closed here as a self-closing span. So I will close it. And right below it, I will open up another span element right here. But make sure to properly close whatever we have opened right here. Yep, this span must not have an opening bracket right here. And this call part will be moved within the second span, okay? So we have a second span where we have this call status inactive or active. And then we have this span, which is self-closing, that only has its own styles right here. I'll show you exactly what that does very soon. But what matters most is that right now we have a call button. We'll also have some kind of a ping animation while the call is happening. And if we're currently on the call, then we'll see this end call button. Now, what we can also do with Vapi is extract the transcript of the conversation we're having. We can do that by, for now, creating some kind of a mock messages array. So I'll say const messages is equal to an array of strings, something like what's your name? And then a second one of my name is John Doe. Nice to meet you. And then we can also extract the last message by saying const last message is equal to messages.length -1. So here we have the full array and here we have the last message. Now we can use those right here when trying to render the transcript. So right below this div where we have 3 divs, but above the button, I will check whether the messages.length is greater than 0, which means that we have some messages in the transcript. In that case, I'll render a div with a class name of transcript-border, and below it, I'll render another div or rather within it, I'll render another div with a class name of transcript. And within that div, I'll render a p tag with a key equal to last message, a class name equal to, let's wait for it. We'll give it a class name as soon as we render it. So let's first display the last message right here within this p tag. And there we go. My name is John Doe. Nice to meet you. So when you're speaking, you'll also be able to see the transcript of the conversation in real time. Let's style it a bit by giving it a CN class name here and pass over the transition dash opacity, duration of 500, and opacity of 0 by default. But then we can pass the animate, fade in, and opacity of 100. We'll turn this on later on so it nicely loads as soon as the new message appears. Perfect. So now we have this UI, but of course you're supposed to be having an interview on a desktop device. So if you head over to desktop, this is looking even better as we have this pulsing ring, meaning the AI is speaking. And then you have you right here smiling and answering all the questions properly. And then the transcript of the conversation. Right now, this is just the UI, but very soon, as soon as we set up the AI bot, as well as Vapi's AI agent, we'll make it speak. So let's do that next. For now, I will just commit this by saying git add dot, git commit -m, implement interview generation page UI, and git push, just so we have a clean environment so that in the next lesson, we can start setting up our AI. The next feature we're going to develop is the ability to generate custom interviews using an AI assistant. The way it works is basically we'll get the user choices from AI and feed it into Gemini to generate proper interview questions. So head over to aistudio.google.com. I'll leave the link in the video kit down below and sign in using your Google account. Then click on the Get API Key and click Create API Key. Let's wait until it gets generated. And once it does, just copy it. Head back to your code into your .env.local and save it right here at the end by calling it Google Generative AI API Key and make it equal to this key that you just copied. And Gemini is completely free, so you can use it and continue following along with the app without having to pay anything. The way in which we will consume this AI is by using the AI SDK provided by Vercel. It allows you to integrate any kind of a large language model into your application without depending on the specific provider you use. The code will look the same for whichever provider you choose. And in this case, we have chosen Gemini. So let's install this AI SDK by Vercel by heading over into our terminal and running npm install AI as well as @ai-sdk/Google. And with that, we are ready to use Gemini in the next lesson. But this AI on its own will not speak. So in the next lesson, let me show you how we can integrate the power of Gemini as well as make it speak. In the last lesson, we got our Gemini API key. But for our application, we needed to speak like a human. And to do that, we'll use Vapi, the best voice AI agents for developers. If you haven't already, click the link down in the description to be able to follow along and see exactly what I'm seeing and sign up. Once you're in, at the start of this video, I already led you through the process of creating your assistant. You just have to click Create Assistant and start from a blank template. I called it Interview Prep. And once you do that, you'll also have to create your workflow and then attach this assistant to that workflow. That's it. But let's actually follow the docs and see what they say. We'll use Vapi's Web SDK, allowing you to integrate Vapi into your web app. The Web SDK will provide us with a simple API for interacting with the real-time call functionalities of Vapi. So let's install it by running npm install @vapi AI/web. So back in the code, I'll just paste this command, and we'll also have to extract our environment variables. So visit your Vapi dashboard, head over to org settings right here, and then API keys. Head over to your public key and copy it. For now, we'll use this public version. Next, open up your .env.local and put it right here by saying next_public Vapi web token and make it equal to the token you just copied. Now, back in the docs, we are ready to initialize our new Vapi client. So let's do just that. I'll create a new file within the lib folder, and I'll call it vapi.sdk.ts. I will import Vapi coming from @Vapi AI web, and right below, I'll create and export a new instance of Vapi by making it equal to new Vapi, to which we can pass over the environment variable we just copied, process.env dot next_public_Vapi_web_token. You can also end it with an exclamation mark because we're specifying that it actually does exist within our environment variables. Before we build this AI assistant, let's break down exactly what we'll need to make it happen. We have to start by creating an AI assistant that can take in some information from us, such as data on whether we want it to be a front-end interview, a back-end one, behavioral or technical, what technologies we want to focus on, and so on. Think of it as trying to call a restaurant and trying to book a table. You'll give them the information on how many people will come, what kind of food you want to eat, and around what time you want to arrive. So to achieve this, we'll use Vapi Workflows, a tool that simplifies the process of building conversational AI. It'll allow us to design conversations as a series of steps or nodes, guiding the AI on what to ask and how to respond based on the user input. Remember the example of booking a restaurant table. And then after we collect those user responses through the AI assistant, we'll then feed it to Gemini AI to generate AI questions based on the user choices and then store this information in a Firestore database. This storage will enable us to display the gathered data on the dashboard so we can later on analyze it in more detail. And with all of this new info that we have, it'll be super simple to feed it to AI and make it the perfect interviewer, personalized for your specific job. So in simple terms, here's how this feature will work. First, a user will initiate a call with the AI assistant, which is structured using the Vapi workflows. The assistant will then ask a series of predefined questions, collecting the user's responses. Once all questions are answered, the assistant will end the call and send the collected information to our API endpoint. The API will then feed this info over to Gemini, get the response back, and store this data in the Firestore database. So we have to start with developing that API endpoint first, to which Vapi workflow will make a call. Think of it like cron jobs. Something happens, and then we call that endpoint. To develop this, we'll need to use Next.js's route handlers. They allow you to create backend routes within your application. So to get started, create a new folder within our app folder and call it API. And within API, create another folder, which you can call Vapi. Within Vapi, create yet another folder, which will act as a route, and I'll call it generate. And within generate, call a file called route.ts. And within there, add a simple route that simply says, hey, we're live. The way you create routes in Next.js is by creating regular functions. So say export async function, get, because it's a get request, and then return response.json, to which you pass the success of true and data, something like thank you. And the second parameter will be an object with a status of 200. So now if we save it, we have to somehow test it. And the best way to test it is by using some kind of an HTTP client. There are many clients like Postman or Insomnia, but I just needed something simple. So recently I downloaded HTTP as it is a super lightweight HTTP client. You can run it completely in the browser if you want to, but recently I also downloaded the desktop version. So let's try to make a request, which is going to be a GET request to localhost 3000 API Vapi generate. And we don't have to pass anything as the body. So I'll click send, And if you get back a 200, that means that you have successfully created your Next.js API route. Now, in this same file, we want to develop a post route that is responsible for getting the questions generated from Gemini and saving that in the new interview. So let's implement it by creating and exporting a new asynchronous function, this time a post request. So since it's a post, we have access to the request data right here through props. And I can kind of assume which data will need to pass to it later on. So we can destructure it by saying const. And the way in which you can get access to the request body by using Next.js is by saying await request.json. So what are some of the things that we might need to pass into this function to truly make our interview personalized? Well, it's going to be the type of the interview, the role, the level, the tech stack, maybe the amount of questions that we have, as well as the user ID. In this case, it is lowercase right here. So make sure to note that. And once we get those values, let's open up a try and catch block. And in the catch, we can simply console.error, that specific error, as well as return the response by saying return response.json, where success is set to false and an error is set to error, with a status code of 500, which means that something went wrong. But more importantly, what if something goes right? How do we actually generate this AI text that our Vapi AI agent will then use? Well, let me explain. Since we're using Next.js's AI SDK, it makes it super simple. The only thing you have to say is const, destructure the text, and make it equal to an await call to a function called generate text. And this is coming from AI. To this generate text, you have to pass an options object. First, you have to specify what is the model of the AI you're trying to use. In this case, the model is Google, coming from AI SDK Google. And if you call it, you can specify which one it is exactly. In this case, we'll use Gemini 2.0 Flash 001. So make sure to copy this exactly as it is. After that, more importantly, we have to pass the prompt. The prompt that'll look something like this: prepare questions for a job interview. But of course, prompting is really an art. So I took quite some time to go back and forth and make sure to get it just right. I wrote about a paragraph and I was getting phenomenal results. So somewhere below this video, either in the video kit or in the repos README, you'll be able to find the prompt that you can copy. So once you find it, simply paste it here. You'll get the model and the prompt, and let's go ahead and read it out together. Prepare questions for a job interview. The job is for a specific role. The level of experience is as follows. The tech stack used is this one. The focus between behavioral and technical questions should lean toward either behavioral or technical. The amount of questions required is amount. Please return only the questions without any additional text. And the questions are going to be read by a voice assistant. So do not use any characters that might break the voice assistant, and format the questions in the following way. Thank you. You always want to thank AI assistants because in case the AI apocalypse happens, you'll be safe. Great. And now we can rename this text that we're receiving back from the AI to questions. Once we get the questions that we want our AI model to read to us, or not really read, but actually, speak about them with us. Once we get these questions, we actually want to store them to the database. So the Vapi AI agent can later on use all this useful information. So I'll create a new interview, which is an object that I want to store in the database, and I'll pass it all of the important information, such as the role, type, level, tech stack. For the tech stack, I will just modify it a bit by using the tech stack.split, and I will split it by commas just to make it a bit more tidy. We can also have the list of questions, which is going to be json.parse questions, because AI returns it in a form of a text, but we want to parse it into an array. User ID will be equal to user ID with a lowercase I here. Finalized will be set to true. So have we actually finalized this interview or not? And then we also can render a cover image. Here, you could actually ask the user for which company they're interviewing, and then you could get the cover image here uploaded by them. But in this case, I wanted to keep it simple, so we will just get a random interview cover. Make sure to import it from utils. And finally, we're going to have a created at date, which is going to be equal to new date dot to ISO string. There we go. And this forms the interview that we can now store in the database. So I'll say await db, make sure to import it from Firestore admin, and then on it, call the dot collection of interviews dot add, and we simply want to add the interview we just created. If we create it successfully, we are ready to return a response .json where success is set to true and a status is set to 200. That's within an object as well. There we go. And to test it, we can go back to your HTTP client and make a post request to API Vapi generate. So if I go back here, I'll change this over to a post request and head over into the body. Here, you can pass an object that looks something like this. You can pass a type, either mixed or just something like technical, a role, a level, tech stack, the amount of questions, and the user ID, and make sure that the user ID is your ID coming from Firestore. So if you head over right here to the project overview and Firestore database, you'll want to find this ID and copy it right here. And then you can paste it right here. Once you do that, you can send out that request. It's in progress, and you get success of true, which means that we have successfully generated an interview based on this information. So if you head back into your database and reload, you'll see that now there's a second collection of interviews, which has this interview with 7 questions that Gemini has generated for us based on all of this information that we have passed to it. So the next thing we have to do is deploy our application that we have created so far, only to be able to share this API endpoint that we have created with the Vapi workflow. That way, we won't have to just make a manual request to our localhost. We'll be able to speak with Vapi workflows that will then call the deployed URL, which will then generate this interview for us. We can also test it locally by using ngrok, but it's a complex setup, and frankly, the best and the easiest way to get it done is to deploy this and test it out live. So within my application, I'll first push it to GitHub by saying git add dot, git commit -m, implement interview generation, and git push. Now you can head over to Vercel, and if you followed what we have been doing before, you should already have a GitHub repo that Vercel should recognize, AI mock interviews. So just click import. It'll automatically recognize that it is a Next.js application. And under environment variables, this is a very important step. You will have to copy all of your envs and then just paste them right here, and it'll automatically create new inputs, one for each one of these variables. Oh, but before I go ahead and try to deploy it, there's one thing that we have to do, and that is to ignore any potential ESLint warnings or errors that we have, because even though these are just warnings, not actual errors, they will prevent the build on Vercel from happening. So you have to go over to the next config TS, and here under config options, you can say ESLint, ignore during builds, and set it to true. And we can do a similar thing with TypeScript by saying ignore build errors, set to true. So this way, since we're still developing the application, if we have some small warnings, that's totally okay. We just want to make sure that it's built so we can test out our AI agent functionalities. So I'll have to do another push right now by saying git add dot, git commit -m, ignore ESLint and TypeScript errors. I'll say for now and git push. As soon as you push it, the changes will be recognized by Vercel. So you'll have to get back and see just now, click import, and once again, add all the environment variables. And now you can click deploy. This process takes about a minute, so feel free to pause the video and I'll be right back. And there we go, we are deployed. I like how Vercel changed the confetti for these new lights that are coming from the top. So just continue to the dashboard. And now we can visit our website deployed live. Great job. So in the next lesson, let's work on the most important functionality of the entire project. And welcome to the most exciting part of this entire application, setting up our AI agent workflow. If you haven't already, click the link down in the description to be able to follow along and go to your dashboard. Once you're there, create a new workflow or head over into the workflow you have already created. This right here is called a workflow. And here we have an environment where we can customize it. Within it, there are some nodes, like this say node right here. Currently, it simply says say hello, but let's modify it a bit. Head over to exact, and instead of saying say hello, let's do something like this. Hello. And then we can use a variable syntax with a double curly brace where we can use the username like this. So hello username. Let's prepare your interview. I'll ask you a few questions and generate a perfect interview just for you. Are you ready? Now that we have this node right here that starts the interview generation process, let's click a little plus at the bottom to add a new node. The second node will be a gather node. Clicking on it will allow our AI workflow to ask us specific questions. Choose specify manually, and let's create a couple of values. Variable names are case sensitive, so let's stick to lowercase to avoid mistakes. And descriptions are also important because they're going to give context to the assistant, which will allow for a more natural conversation. The first thing that our AI workflow will gather will be a property of role. What kind of role is the user applying for? So description of that can be something like, what role would you like to train for? For example, front-end, back-end, full stack, design, UX, and I'll take the require checkbox and set it to true. This description just helps the bot figure out what it should say. And in my opinion, if you provide specific examples, like you're expecting specific responses, it's like you're limiting the choices. So what I prefer is actually removing these examples and just make the bot ask an open-ended question, which feels more human. A real human would not start listing out all the options possible. So I'll just add this as a description and save it. So now we first greet the user and then we collect the information about the role. Let's try to also collect a few more pieces. I will specify them manually right here. The second one can be the type of the interview, and within the description, I'll say, are you aiming for a technical, behavioral, or mixed interview? I'll make it required and save it. And we can repeat this for the rest of the steps. The next one being the level of the interview. So for the description, we can say the job experience level required. After that, we can add the tech stack. So here we can say something like a list of technologies to cover during the job interview. Required as well. And finally, we can have the amount. This is referring to how many questions would you like to generate, or we can make it a bit more personal and say, how many questions would you like me to prepare for you? And we can make it required. So here, we are now accepting all sorts of different data that we'll be able to pass into the interview later on. Once we collect that data, we can add another node. This time, an API request. Yep, once the agent greets the user, collects all the necessary information, it can also make an API call for you. Here, we'll have to put the URL to our deployed application. So head over to your Vercel project and click visit. Then, right from your URL, you'll be able to copy the link. Once you copy it, paste it here, https://, and then we have the full URL. But instead of sign in, I'll say /API/Vapi/generate. And how can you know whether you entered the right URL? Well, copy it and try to navigate over to that URL. If in your browser you get a success of true and data as thank you, that means that a GET request for that route exists, which means we have properly deployed it. But here, we're hitting the post route, as our goal is to send over the data to our application that our Vapi agent has gathered for us. So make it a post request, don't add any headers, and for the body, you can start with a role. So what kind of an interview are they trying to go for? And then as the value, you can insert a variable of role and save it. We can repeat this for all of the other fields that we have gathered. So let's enter the second one, which is the type of the interview. So I'll insert the type variable. After that, we'll have the level variable. So we can insert the level. After the level, we will insert the amount. So let's have the amount as well. And finally, we'll have the user ID. Make sure that it is lowercase in this case. So here, we can also pass a user ID, just like this. Make sure to wrap it in a double curly brace and then close it. And then we'll also have the tech stack. So I'll say tech stack. Make sure to spell it like this with a lowercase s. And I'll say tech stack here as well. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 variables we're passing over in the body. For the output, you can leave it empty. And when it comes to run in the background, you can also leave that unticked as it is. Finally, at the end, we can create one more say node. We can make it of a type prompt, and we can tell the agent to say something like, the interview has been generated, and thank the user for the call. After we say that, we can hang up. Seemingly, we're simulating a real phone call right here, but with added functionalities because a phone definitely cannot make an API request on its own. And a phone cannot speak on its own as well. So now that we hang it up, we can click save at the top right. This is super important. Do not, and I repeat, do not forget to press save. There we go. This is our final workflow. Now you can head over to assistants on the left side. And if you haven't already, create a new assistant. Call it something like interview generator and start from a blank template. On the right side, set the provider to Vapi and attach a workflow. If you've done this already before when you were creating the agent in the first place, then you're set. But if you haven't done it, you can just attach it here by selecting an existing JSM interview prep workflow. There we go. So now this agent will perform the following workflow. Now head back over to Assistants and choose your assistant. And you'll notice that you can customize literally anything about this voice, from different people that it can imitate to additional configuration like enabling the office background sound, which is super cool, as well as enabling back channeling, which makes the bot sound more human by saying the words like, you know, and so on. I'll definitely include this to make it sound more personalized. And if you want to change the voice, feel free to do that. I'll choose Hannah, for example. But if you want to take a second and experiment a bit with so many options that we can change here, you can click Talk with Assistant at the top right, and it'll simulate a conversation.
Hello. Let's prepare your interview. I'll ask you a few questions and generate a perfect interview just for you. Are you ready?
Okay, this sounds good. I think this was Elliot. Before I switched over to Hannah and enabled back channeling, I forgot to click publish. So if we're happy with Hannah, we can click publish and then click talk with assistant.
Hello. Let's prepare your interview. I'll ask you a few questions and generate a perfect interview just for you. Are you ready?
Okay, I am definitely ready. Let's go.
Great. What role would you like to train for?
Okay, Hannah is a bit too soft. Maybe we need something a bit more brighter with some personality and more cheerful. So let's try with Lily.
Hello. Let's prepare your interview. I'll ask you a few questions and generate a perfect interview just for you. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's dive right in. Okay, I can already see that Lily will be a good fit. So once you make your final voice, again, feel free to customize it to whatever you prefer. Go ahead and copy this assistant ID and head over into your code base where you can create a new environment variable. Call it next public Vapi workflow ID and make it equal to the ID that you just copied. Also, once you do that, don't forget to head over to your Vercel project, head over to settings, environment variables, and the second variable you have to add is the next public base URL and make it equal to the URL of your website where we have deployed the app on Vercel. Click save and it'll let you know that our environment variables have been added and a new deployment is needed for changes to take effect. So let's just click redeploy. Perfect. Deployment is in progress. So with that in mind, you have successfully created your Vapi AI voice agent that not only speaks super well, and you can modify its speech cadence or change the additional configuration, but you have also made that agent follow a specific workflow. It'll start by saying, "Hello, Adrian, let's prepare your interview." It'll then gather all the important information, and finally, it'll make an API request on its own behind the scenes so you don't ever have to touch anything, and it'll complete the call. I mean, just imagine how many useful use cases there are for this technology. Let's say you own a restaurant, and there's always something to do there, right? You cannot sit there and just take calls. So just imagine having this agent stay there, and people can call it, and it can look up different information from the calendar, tell them when the table is available, gather their information about their preferences, the number of people, the time, food, allergies, and so on. And finally, it can just make an API request on its own to finalize the booking. Pretty cool, right? So that part is now done. In the next lesson, we'll put it to use within our code. We've created an AI assistant, a workflow that assistant will follow, as well as an API endpoint that this agent can call and bring all of those data pieces back to us. So we are ready to put it all together within the interview page. Head over into app, root, interview page, and we want to pass over the user information to the agent. We can do that by pulling the information from our server action we have created before. Const user is equal to await get current user coming from lib actions, and we have to make the function async. And we can now pass this user information, such as the username, to the agent of user ?name. The user ID will be equal to user ?ID, and finally the type will be set to generate. This agent is a shared component, as you know. We'll use it later on when we actually take the interview. But for now, we want to tell it that the only job of this AI agent is to actually take the information from the user about what kind of interview we need to generate in the first place. So this is its purpose. Now we can head over to the agent page and we can accept all of those props. So first we're getting the username. We can also get the user ID as well as the type of the agent, and we can implement its functionality. First, we'll need to get access to the router by making it equal to the use router call. And this agent will have to be rendered on the client side. So I'll add the use client directive at the top. Now there will have to be a lot of different states and use effects to handle the different states of the call that we have. So let me create them immediately. We can create the first use state snippet and call it is speaking and set is speaking. At the start, set to false. Then we can have the call status, which will not just be a single static variable. Instead, it'll be a state, same like this is speaking. So let me create a new use state snippet, and let me call it call status, set call status of a type call status at the start equal to call status dot inactive. Then we want to create a state for these messages as well. we're not just going to have a list of static messages. So let me say const messages and set messages at the start equal to a use state of a type saved message array, and at the start it'll be equal to an empty array. So how will this message look like? Well, we can define it right above as a TypeScript interface by saying interface saved message. First thing we have to know is who is saying that message. Is it a user? Is it maybe the system? Or is it the assistant? So we can have these three types, and then we need to have the content of that message, which will be of a type string. Perfect. So now we have all of these states that we can work with. For now, of course, our application is not working because before we were using the fake data, but now we're trying to make it dynamic and actually hook into Vapi's functionalities. So I'll first create a new use effect hook, and I'll define a callback function and define when this use effect will be called. In this case, we'll only call this use effect at the start. So here we can establish a baseline of what's happening when. First, I'll declare a new function called onCallStart, which is just a callback function that sets the call status to call status dot active. That's what happens on the call start. In the similar way, we can define what happens on call end. So we can say const on call end, and here we can set the call status to finished. After that, we can change the status on message. So const on message, we will accept the message of a type message, and then we want to check if the message.type is triple equal to transcript, and if message.transcript type is final, so is equal to final, that means that we can save it somewhere. So let's form a new message equal to an object that has a role of message.role and content equal to message.transcript, and we can set that message to the list of the messages array by first taking the current list or the previous list of messages, spreading all of the previous messages, and then appending the new message right at the end of that list, therefore adding it to the list. So this is what happens on message. Now, what happens on speech start? Let's define that too. Const on speech start, we can simply set the state of set is speaking to true. And what happens on speech end? We simply want to set is speaking to false. And of course, what happens on error? Const on error, we accept that error of a type error, and we will simply console log the error alongside its error message. Now that we have all of these functions that define what happens at different stages of the call, we can now forward them over to Vapi. You can think of them as Vapi event listeners. I'll say vapi.on and make sure to import Vapi right at the top by saying import destructured Vapi from @/lib/vapi.sdk and say vapi.on call-start. Well, we can call the on call start function like this. And we can now repeat this for all the different stages. Vapi.on call end, we can pass over the on call end functionality. What about Vapi.on message? Well, then we can say on message. Vapi.on speech start. Well, we can call the on speech start handler or listener. Vapi.on speech end. There we can call the on speech end. And finally, Vapi.on error, we can call on error. So now we're handling all of these listeners. But whenever you open up listeners in a use effect, you also have to clear them. So copy this entire list of listeners, and let's close them off when this component gets unmounted by saying return, and then return an object where you can call all of these right here. But this time, instead of on, we will simply pass off to turn it off so it doesn't slow our application any further if we're not using it. Perfect. So this was the use effect that tells our application what it needs to do whenever certain states of the conversation with Vapi get triggered. Now, below this use effect, we also want to create another use effect that'll be executed whenever anything changes. So I can say use effect, we have a callback function, and in the dependency array, I want to recall it when we have a new message, when the call status changes, when the type changes, or when the user ID changes. Here, I want to check if call status is triple equal to call status dot finished. And if it is finished, then I want to call the router dot push and point the user back to the home page so they can see their newly generated interview. The reason why we're not pointing them to interviews /ID that was just generated is because it could take some time for the interview to be generated. So it's best if we move them over to the homepage first, and then they can manually find it on the homepage. Great. Finally, we have to implement two functions. One that'll start the call, so it'll be equal to an asynchronous callback function, and one that will handle the disconnect of the call. So I'll say handle call and handle disconnect. In the handle call, I will say set call status to call status dot connecting, and we can call Vapi and actually tell it to start the call by saying await Vapi dot start process.env dot next underscore public underscore Vapi workflow ID. So we're telling it to start a conversation with this specific agent. And we can also provide some additional options, such as variable values of username. Make sure that it is all lowercase, to user name. Here it is uppercase. And we can also pass the user ID, lowercase, equal to the user ID, which has the uppercase I. So here we're handling the start of the call. And now we have to handle the disconnect, which is super simple. We just set the call status to call status dot finished. And we simply call Vapi and tell it to stop. Super simple. Now, remember before how we were getting the last message from the messages array? Well, we need to do the same thing now. So const latest message is equal to messages, and then get into it. Check out how many messages there are, and pick out the last message, and give me its content. So that's how we can get the last message in the array. And it will also be cool for us to figure out whether the call is currently inactive or finished. So you can say const is call inactive or finished. And that'll be the case if the call status is either inactive or the call status is equal to finished. So now we have all of the functions that we have to call, and we have also given Vapi all the information that it needs to know what it has to do whenever something happens, when a call starts, ends, when we send a message, start the speech, and so on. So we are ready to use it right within the code. Here, we're already using the last message. I think now we called it latest message because there can be more messages in the array. So I'll rename this to latest message. And then if we go a bit down, here it's complaining that call status is either connecting, and then we make it hidden. I think I'm missing a double ampersand here, because if it is connecting, then make it hidden, okay? So for now, we're good. And finally, in this span, instead of checking for this right here, which is cluttering our JSX, we can now just call the is call inactive or finished. If it's inactive or finished, simply give me the call button so I can call it once again, or else say ... which means, we're currently on the call. And most importantly, when we end the call, we can do that with this button click. So I'll say on click, handle disconnect. But of course, how can we disconnect it if we didn't even start it in the first place? That's what matters the most. So on this button right here, that is supposed to say call, it's right here, btn call. We can actually call the on click and pass it the handle call functionality. And with that, we have created our bot or the code that should allow our agent to speak with us within our application. Back on the interview page, you can see that it's not pulsing anymore. That's because now it's taking the real state of the call, and it'll give us the feedback only once we click the call button. So let's go ahead and test it out. I'll click call.
Hello, Adrian. Let's prepare your interview. I'll ask you a few questions and generate a perfect interview just for you. Are you ready?
Born ready. Let's dive right in.
Great. Let's start with your preferred interview focus. Are you aiming for a technical, behavioral, or mixed interview?
Well, technical it is.
Got it. And what role are you looking to train for?
Front end.
Perfect. What's the job experience level you're targeting?
I'm targeting a senior level.
Thanks for that. Can you tell me the technologies you want to cover during the interview?
The usual React, JavaScript, Next.js.
Understood. Lastly, how many questions should I prepare for you?
Let's just do 2.
Thanks for your patience. I'm happy to let you know that the interview has been successfully generated. If there's anything else you need or any other questions you have, just let me know.
Will do, thank you. Okay, we have been redirected to the homepage. This looked okay, and we got an error saying that the meeting has ended. So we can look into what that is, but first I'm wondering how far did we get into the actual interview creation process. So if I check out the console right here, it looks like the error is coming from line 42 of the agent TSX file. It says exiting meeting because room was deleted. Okay, but what I care the most about right now is whether the interview has been created in Firebase. So head over to your Firebase project and go to the Firestore database. Here, you should be able to see users, and now we also have interviews. There we go. I have an interview where I was aiming for a senior position, and I asked it to generate only 2 questions for a front-end position on technologies React, JavaScript, and Next.js. Looks like my interview has been created. Perfect. Now in the next lesson, we can actually show this newly created interview right here on the homepage, so we can actually prepare to take it. Generation is one thing, but taking a mock interview is another. So let's first display it right here on the homepage. To show the newly generated interview on the homepage, we have to first create an action that'll fetch it from the database. So let's head over into lib, actions, and then auth.action.ts. Within here, we can write a simple function that'll fetch all the interviews associated with that specific user. So I'll say export async function get interview by user ID. And of course, we'll accept the user ID of a type string into the function, and it'll return a promise that will return an array of interviews or just a null if it cannot find any. And we can open up a function block. First things first, we can immediately try to fetch all the interviews by making it equal to an await call to db.collection, where we're going to try to look for a collection of interviews where the user ID is double equal to the user ID, like this. And we want to order it by created at in a descending order. So I'll say DESC. It's pretty interesting how every single library or database has its own ways of fetching the data. Here, you just say where, and then define which property, which type of equality you're looking for, and then which field, and similar for the ordering and searching for different collections. And finally, we say .get. Finally, once we do get those interviews, we can say return interviews.docs.map, where we get each individual document, and for each one, we automatically return an object. And when I say automatically return an object, I mean wrap it in parentheses for an immediate return. And then we can say ID is equal to doc.id, and then we want to spread out the rest of the doc data. That's going to look something like this as interview array. Perfect. So now we're returning exactly what we need on the homepage. So let's head over into page.tsx, and instead of mapping over the dummy interviews, Now let's call the real ones. So right at the top, I'll first fetch the user by saying const user is equal to await get current user. Once we have the user, we can try to fetch the user interviews by saying const user interviews is equal to await get interviews by user ID, and we have to pass over the user $.id, and we can say that we know that it'll be there. Of course, since we're using awaits here, we have to turn this page into an asynchronous page, and don't forget to import this function we just created. Get interviews. I had a typo right here, so that is get interviews by user ID coming from lib actions auth actions. And we can also check whether we have any past interviews by saying const has past interviews is equal to if user interviews $.length is greater than 0. Great. So now with this in mind, we can actually display real data. Let's head over into the first interviews section where it says your interviews. Instead of mapping over the dummy data, I'll first check if has past interviews is true, then we can map over the user interviews $.map, where we get each individual interview, and for each interview, we will return an interview card. So I'll take it right from here, indent it properly, and we can remove these fake interviews from there. Okay, now let's make sure that all of this is properly indented and closed up. Of course, this ternary expression also needs its second part. So say if doesn't have past interviews, then we can show this p tag that we have at the bottom. So let me open up a new block of code and put the p tag right within it. There we go. And we need to close this dynamic block of code. This is perfect. So now we are mapping over and hopefully showing the interview cards for the existing interviews, or we can show a paragraph that says, hey, you haven't taken any interviews yet. Now, when you get all excited and go back to the homepage and try to take that interview that you generated, unfortunately, you'll get an error. Firebase will say that some kind of a query is required. Interesting. Well, you'll have to follow the link that they provide you right here. So copy it and paste it in your browser. Then you'll have to authenticate using the same Google account that you created your Firebase project with. And it'll automatically prompt you to create indices that'll allow us to map over our elements. So let's click save. And the reason this error occurs is because we're performing a query that finds only interviews created by user. That's where the where and created at need to be indexed before using them. You'll also see the status of this, so it's gonna say building. So we'll have to wait a bit until these indices get built. But while that is taking some time, let's actually head back over to auth action and let's create another function that retrieves a list of other interviews, not only created by our current user, but rather created by other users. I'll start working on it by copying the entire function for getting the user's interview and paste it below. And we just have to modify it into the get latest interviews. This one will take in the params, not the user ID. The params will be of a type get latest interviews params, and it'll also return a promise resulting in an array of interviews. Same thing happens. We try to fetch the interviews, but before that, we can get access to the user ID as well as the limit of about 20, maybe by default, coming from params. So in this case, we'll try to get the collection of interviews. We want to order it by created at descending, where finalized is equal to true, and where the user ID is not equal to the current user ID. And finally, we can call them. If you want to, we can also limit the amount that we get back to something like the limit that we set above. 20 by default is okay. And then we return them. Now, if we head back over to the page, we can do a similar thing that we have done before, but we're not amateurs. We're not going to do one after another because they would block each other, and they don't need to do that as they don't depend on one another. So here, we'll use a concept known as parallel requests, which will allow us to fetch both of these at the same time. First, let me write it normally, and then I'll show you the optimization. I'll say const latest interviews is equal to await get latest interviews, to which we can pass an object of user ID is user !ID. So now we're getting one after another, but what you can do is say const and then use array destructuring and use the await promise.all. What promise.all allows you to do is to fetch them in parallel, as these requests don't depend one on another. So in an array, you can provide just the two calls. This is going to be the first call, and this is going to be the second call, happening at the same time. And then, where do we get the results of those two calls? Well, you get them right here within this array, the user interviews and the latest interviews. And this is essentially doubling the speed in which we're making both of these requests. This just reminded me of one of the chapters of the Ultimate Next.js course, where we're showing the top questions and popular tags in our Dev Overflow application. And then we have a whole lesson dedicated on optimization, where I show you different ways of optimizing your queries. One of which, of course, is parallel data fetching. Okay, now that we have both the user interviews and the latest interviews, we're getting ready to show them. Here, we can have another Boolean saying has upcoming interviews. So these are the interviews that we haven't created and we haven't taken yet. So I'll say is equal to latest interviews, length is greater than 0. So if that is the case, we can show them right below where it says take an interview. We can essentially duplicate this part right here with the past interviews and then paste it here. But this time, instead of past interviews, it'll be has upcoming interviews. And instead of user interviews, it'll be latest interviews. And instead of you haven't taken any interviews yet, we can say something like there are no new interviews available. Great. Now, if you head back, you might see a similar error. So just copy this URL one more time and paste it into your URL bar. You'll have to authenticate using the same email one more time, and then you can add another index. Wait for this second index to be built, and you can even delete the previous one because this new one contains all of the fields that the previous one has as well. So just pause the video and wait for it to build. There we go. My indices have been built. So if I head back over to localhost 3000, I would expect to see a fully functional page, but I still see a failed precondition. Let me go ahead and copy this URL as well and paste it into the bar, and I'll add this index. It looks like created at needs creation. Okay, let me go ahead and save it and see what Google does behind the scenes. There we go. This index has been built. So if you head back over to your localhost 3000, you should be able to see that now we have 2 interviews right here, or maybe on your end, you have 1. Either way, it seems like some interviews have been generated, which corresponds to the storage that we have right here, seeing 2 interviews. Of course, if you want to see the interviews under the second section, you'll have to create a new user and then generate another interview so that it appears for the second user. Let's actually try that. Right now, we don't really have a logout button, but if you head over to the application tab and head over to cookies, you can clear all of those cookies and reload, which should bring us right to the sign-in page. I'll sign in with my second account. I'll call it JS Mastery. And once you create your account, you should also be able to sign in with it. There we go. Now we can see 2 interviews right here that somebody else has generated, our first account, and on this account, we can create our own interview. So before we go ahead and implement the taking of the mock interview logic in the next lesson, one more time, let's test out the generation of an interview. Let's start it, and let's start the call.
Hello, JS Mastery. Let's prepare your interview. I'll ask you a few questions and generate a perfect interview just for you. Are you ready?
Let's dive right in.
Sure. First, could you please tell me what role you would like to train for?
Let's do backend.
Great. Are you aiming for a technical, behavioral, or mixed interview?
Let's do behavioral.
Perfect. What is the job experience level you're aiming?
I'm aiming for a junior job.
Got it. How many questions would you like me to prepare for you?
I'm a beginner. Give me just one.
Understood. Finally, could you please tell me which technologies you'd like to cover during the job interview?
Oh, you know what? HTML, CSS, JavaScript.
Thanks for holding. The interview has been generated. If you need any more assistance or have questions about the next steps, just let me know.
Sounds good. Okay, I ended the call, and there we go. We have a backend interview, which is behavioral and is about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Pretty cool stuff. Let's go ahead and commit the changes we have generated so far. So I'll open up the second terminal, say git add dot git commit -m show generated interviews on the homepage. Oh, looks like I misspelled the word commit. And we can run git push. In the next lesson, let's work on the logic for actually viewing the interview we have generated. At the moment, if you click View Interview on one of the interviews you have created or that other people have created, you'll be redirected over to a 404 interview undefined. So we'll need to create a new page. We can do that by heading over to our application, the app folder, root, and then interview. And within here, we can create a new folder, which will actually be a dynamic route based on the ID of the interview. And then within this ID, I'll create a new page.tsx. We can use RAFCE to quickly create this page, and we can quickly create a function that returns the interview details so we can display them on the page. So we can head over into lib, actions, and we can create a new action file called general.action.ts. And I just noticed that we should have created this before when I created these two get interview by ID and get latest interviews. So I'll actually copy those two functions and I'll move them over to the general actions right here. There we go. Make sure to move all the imports as well. And we're using them in our homepage. That's going to be in the root. Make sure to modify the imports so that they are coming from the general action. So I'll import them right here and say general.action. Great. And we can also remove these dummy constants. Now, right below these two, we can also duplicate this first one and create a new one that will allow us to fetch the interview details. So I'll call it get interview by ID. And instead of accepting a user ID, it'll accept the ID of the interview, and it'll return a promise that resolves in not an array of interviews, but rather just a single interview. So I'll say interview db.collection of interviews and just .doc where we have this ID .get. Finally, this will not be interviews. It'll be rather just a single interview. So we can say return interview.data as interview or null. There we go. So now we are getting and returning the interview details by ID. So we can head back over to this dynamic page we have created, and within this page, we can fetch it. But first, let's extract the parameter of this page we're currently on. See, in Next.js, due to a dynamic file-based routing, when you create a dynamic route, you can extract it right here through params. So destructure the params and set it to be of a type route params, and then simply destructure whatever the name of that route is. In this case, we'll destructure the ID coming from params. Make sure to turn this page into an asynchronous page. There we go. Once you get the ID, we can get the interview details based on that ID. So I'll say const interview is equal to await get interview by ID, and we can pass over the ID. Finally, if there is no interview, then we can redirect back to the home page. Make sure to import this redirect from Next navigation. Great. But if we do have something to show, well, let's show it. I'll put my browser side by side with my editor, and I'll click View Interview. And it'll take me to a new page, but very quickly I get redirected back to the home page. I think that's because this View Interview button is not working properly. It's pointing to the undefined route. So let's quickly head over into our interview card component, and let's see what this interview ID is. So interview ID is coming from right here as the prop to the interview card. So let's see where we're calling the interview card in our code. We're calling it on root page 43 and 56. And in both cases, we are spreading all of the interview properties. So what does our interview have? We can take a look by exploring the interface. It has the ID, role, level, and so on, but it doesn't have an interview ID. So I think we just needed to refer to the ID here. So heading back over to the interview card, instead of saying interview ID, I will just destructure the ID and use the ID. There we go. ID here, and ID here as well. And under interview card props, we can also say that this will be an ID. Okay, good. Now, if I click View Interview, we'll actually be redirected to a page that has a real interview ID, and we are ready to start showing the details for that interview. So first, let's wrap everything in an empty React fragment, and within it, let's display a div that'll have a class name equal to flex, flex-row, and a gap of 4. It'll also have justify between, so we nicely display the elements on the screen. Within it, I'll render another div that'll have a class name of flex, flex-row, a gap of 4, items-center, and on Mac small devices, flex-call. And right below it, I'll render a div with a class name of flex, flex-row, gap of 4, and items-center. And here we can display some information about the interview, such as the image with a source of get random interview cover with an alt tag of cover image, a width of about 40, a height of about 40 as well, and a class name of rounded-full object-cover and a size of 40 pixels. Now, if we close it and save it, you should be able to see a logo right here. And below it, we can render an H3 for the title of that interview. So I can render a class name of capitalize and say interview.role and then render interview right here. So it'll say backend interview. Right below this div, we can also display the tech icons. And we can pass over the tech stack as interview.techstack. You can see how simple it is to render it once we actually have created this component before. And we can head below one more div and render a p tag that'll render the interview type. There we go, behavioral. And we can give it a class name of bgdark200, padding x of 4, padding y of 2, rounded-lg, h-fit, and capitalize. And now this is looking great. Alongside reusing a couple of pieces to create what we see here, we'll also reuse the same agent component we used to generate interviews to now help us with conducting the actual mock interview. So right below this div, let's create an agent, which we can import from components agent, pass the username of user?name. We can also pass the type equal to user?id. And I'm just looking at this right now, and I notice that we don't have access to the user right here. We only have access to the interview details. But getting access to the user is super simple because we have already created a hook that helps us with just that. So I'll say const user is equal to await get current user. There we go. So if we save it, we can provide a proper username as well as a proper type. We also have to pass over the interview ID equal to ID and a type. In this case, the type is not generate, it is actually interview. So this is allowing us to see some differences between the two uses of the agent component. And finally, we have to provide the questions equal to interview dot questions. Great. So now we have this AI interviewer that we can call. This time not to generate an interview, but rather to conduct an interview with us. Thankfully, we won't have to make many changes to the agent component, as it'll be super similar to the code when we set up the event listeners right here. We only have to change a couple of things, mainly the vapi.start command, as it's used to start the call with an AI agent. Instead of providing some information to it, we'll provide it with interview questions and a couple of custom parameters, so we have different AI agents that we can speak with, not the same AI agent that we spoke previously when generating the interview. So let's make those changes. In the props, we'll also accept an interview ID, as well as the list of questions, which will feed into this agent. Now, right here where we have the use effect, specifically this one that we call whenever something changes, here, we're not just going to use the router.push. Instead, we want to check whether we're on a call to generate an interview or are we taking an interview right now. So I'll first add an if statement to check if the call status is finished. That's the same one we had right here. But then I'll add an inner if statement right within it to check if the type is triple equal to generate. If that is the case, well, sure, we'll then push over to the homepage after we generate an interview. But else, we will handle the generate feedback with the messages we'll pass over into it. What is this function? Well, you can think of this one as just the router.push with some extra steps. At the end of the day, we'll also push to the homepage or to the feedback page. But we also want to call a function that'll generate some feedback. So let me create it right here at the top. Let's call it handle generate feedback and make it equal to an asynchronous function that accepts the entire transcript as a list of saved messages, because it has to take the transcript to be able to generate feedback based on the entire conversation. And here we can put a console log that'll say generate feedback here. After that, we can destructure the success and the ID from the action where we'll actually generate that feedback. But for now, I'll mock it by creating a fake success of true and an ID of feedback ID, just so we can make a check and see if success is true and if ID exists. Then let's use a router.push to push over to the interview details page by heading over to /interview /interview ID /feedback. There we go. And if it's not a success, we can console log an error saying error saving feedback, as well as push back to the homepage because something went wrong. Okay, hopefully this makes sense. And here I'm missing a double ampersand. So if success and an ID. Great, but this part still remains a to-do. We'll have to create a server action that generates feedback. That's going to be the next step. But for now, we want to focus on actually handling this mock interview call. So let's head over into the handle call action, where we currently start a new conversation. But now we'll start a different conversation depending on whether we're taking a call or generating one. So I'll add an if statement and check if type is equal to generate. If it is, I'll simply move over this await vapi.start and give it over the workflow ID because it'll use that workflow to figure out what kind of interview we want to generate. But else, if we're not trying to generate an interview, then we want to provide an array of questions for an interviewer to ask. So I'll say let formatted questions is equal to an empty string. And then I'll say if questions exist, then formatted questions is equal to questions dot map, where we get each individual question, and for each one we return a dash and then a question, like in a bullet point form, and then it will join them by using a /n. This is a new line character. And then based off of these questions, we can start a new Vapi call. So right below this if statement, I'll say await Vapi.start. But this time we want to specify an interviewer details. So we want to say exactly how this interviewer should behave and what it should do. And then as the second parameter, we need to provide over some variable values, such as the list of questions that it can ask. So I'll say questions is equal to formatted questions. But how can we actually set this interviewer? Like, where is it coming from and what it even is? What is this configuration all about? Well, we can head over into the constants file that is right here under constants index.ts. And here we had a lot of code that we left commented out, but now we are ready to uncomment it because we have installed all the necessary packages. So simply select all of the commented out lines, head back over to where we have this string of interviewer and start typing interviewer, and you'll be able to automatically import it from constants. So how does this interviewer exactly look like? Well, I was playing around a bit with its configuration and I had most success with this. Name is interviewer. First message is hello, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. Excited to learn more about your experience. And then we provide a transcriber with a model. So Vapi also allows you to choose between different transcribers. And then finally, the voice you want this agent to take with different properties like stability, similarity boost, speed, style, and more. And finally, the model we want to use for this voice agent. I'm using GPT-4 from OpenAI. And of course, the prompt matters a lot. So I created a prompt right here saying you're a professional job interviewer conducting a real-time voice interview with a candidate. Your goal is to assess their qualifications, motivation, and fit for the role. You know, I provide a list of questions right here that have been generated before based on the previous conversation we've had with the workflow agent. Engage naturally, react appropriately, use official yet friendly language. If asked about the role, company, provide a clear and relevant answer. Be professional, polite, short, and simple. Great. So with this in mind, now this second agent should take a completely different form than before. It should basically be like you're talking to a different person. So what do you say that we give it a shot? I'll head back over here and let's take this quick backend interview. I believe it was supposed to be super simple, beginner level with like one question. So I'll say view interview, which redirected me to the interview page. And now I will click call.
Hello. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I'm excited to learn more about you and your experience.
Well, excited to be here.
Great to hear that. Let's dive in. Can you describe a time you faced a challenging technical problem while working on a project? How did you approach it? What resources did you use and what was the outcome?
Oh, that's a tough one. Well, you know, on my day-to-day job, there's a lot of bugs, a lot of errors, a lot of stuff breaking, you know, the usual. I just went a bit on Stack Overflow and asked a couple of questions on JS Mastery Pro Discord server. Some mentors there were super helpful. But, you know, the community helps, and yeah, just trying to debug it on my own.
It sounds like you actively sought out resources and community support, which is great. Could you tell me more about the specific problem you faced and how these efforts led to a resolution?
Yeah, don't really have time right now. I'm just testing you for a demo of the project.
Understood. Thank you for letting me know. If you'd like to continue the conversation later, feel free to reconnect. Have a great day.
Have a great day. And I ended the call right there. The conversation seemed good, but at the end of the day, what we care about the most is not the actual conversation, but rather the feedback that we get from it so we can better prepare for the real interviews. So for now, let's go ahead and commit what we implemented in this lesson. I'll say git add dot, git commit -m, implement interview session, and git push. And in the next lesson, let's focus on creating the feedback page. In this lesson, we'll create the feedback and show it on the feedback page. So first, head over to our lib folder, and then to actions, and then general.action.ts. Within here, we can create a server action that'll create feedback in our Firestore database using Gemini AI. So first things first, let's export an async function called create feedback, which will take in some params of a type create feedback params, and we can just try to destructure those params at the top. We'll need an interview ID to know for which interview we're providing the feedback for. We'll need the user ID to know for which user that feedback is. And finally, the transcript of the interview, the most important part for AI to be able to make a decision on which feedback to give, because it needs to look into the entire conversation through text. Then I'll open up a try and catch block. And in the catch, if there's an error, well, we can simply say console.error and say error saving feedback. And then we can display some kind of an error right here. But if there's no error, we can try to go over the transcript by formatting it a bit into a better format. So I'll say right here within the try block, const formatted transcript is equal to transcript dot map, where we get each individual sentence, and for each sentence we can define its type. It has a role of a type string as well as content of a type string as well. And then for each one of these sentences, we can return a template string where we start with a dash, so we'll have different bullet points. First, we show a sentence dot role. So this is like admin or AI or interviewer or interviewee. And then we said what that person had said by getting it from sentence dot content. And then we can render a new line at the end. Okay, so this is going to be like AI said, hey, this is the question. And then we answered, hey, this is the answer. That way we can pass it over by joining it like this. And then we can pass it over into Gemini to be able to figure out how well we did. So right at the bottom, we can destructure an object coming from a wait generate object. And this right here is coming from AI. Remember, before we used something like generate text, but here we're using generate object, which allows us to be a bit more specific. Let me show you how. As with generate text, you can also pass the model. In this case, we'll use Google's Gemini 2.0 Flash 001, and we can also pass some additional options, such as structured outputs is set to false. I found that I get more consistent results when I do this. But now, instead of just getting back any random text, in this case, we can define the schema that'll specify how that text will look like. So this schema can be equal to feedback schema, which is coming from constants. So if it's not uncommented yet, uncommented. And then here you can see that this is an object where we say what we're expecting for it to return. We're expecting a total number or total score, which is of a type number, an array of strengths, an array of areas for improvement, and finally a final assessment, as well as category scores. So we'll have 5 different categories: communication skills, technical knowledge, problem solving, cultural fit, and confidence and clarity. And for each one, we want to return the score, which is a number, and a comment, which is a string. And of course, what would this generate object be without the prompt and the system? So prompt defines something like what they're doing. So here we can say, I'll give you the transcript and you assess the candidate. You could do something like that. And then also we have the system. The system allows us to explain what is this AI. So I'll say you are a professional interviewer. Now, of course, these are too simple, and I went ahead and played around to try to come up with prompts and systems that'll return the best and most predictable responses. So somewhere below this video, maybe in the video kit, you'll be able to find this prompt and system to copy it. So once you copy it, it's going to look something like this. You are an AI interviewer analyzing a mock interview. Your task is to evaluate the candidate based on structured categories. Be thorough and detailed. Don't be lenient. If there are mistakes, point them out. We also then, most importantly, we then paste the entire transcript right into it and ask to score the candidate from 0 to 100 in all of these areas. And then I mentioned do not add other categories rather than the ones provided. And for the system, we're saying you're a professional interview analyzer and just analyze it based on the categories. Great. So now that we have fed all of this information, including the formatted schema, we will get it all back within this object, which will contain things like everything we defined. So it'll be a total score. It'll contain a category scores, strengths, areas for improvement, as well as the final assessment. Great. So now we can put that within a new object that will store into the database. So I'll say const feedback is equal to await db.collection of feedback.add. And we want to add a new object. So here we can define what it should have, like an interview ID equal to interview ID, a user ID, so we know which user we're providing the ID for, the total score, the category scores, the strengths as well. Hey, we need areas for improvement, final assessment, and even the created at date, which is equal to new date dot to ISO string. So we know when this feedback took place, so the user can improve it. Once we get back the feedback, we can return an object with a success of true, as well as a feedback ID equal to feedback.id, and that's it. So now we're returning this feedback ID back over to our front end. Of course, once we create it, we'll actually want to fetch it later on, but for now, let's at least create it. I'll head over and create a new feedback page. This one we were missing. So that is /interview/ID/feedback. We can do it by heading over to app, root, interview, and create a new folder called feedback. And within that feedback, create a new page.tsx, inside of which you can run RAFCE. As soon as you do that, this 404 should go away. Oh, but no, feedback is below this dynamic ID property because feedback depends on which interview you're on. So you have to move this folder right within the ID folder. And then instead of a 404, you should be able to see a page. So before we display that feedback, we first have to create it by calling that server action we created not that long ago. And we actually left ourselves a to-do right here within the agent when we handle generate feedback. We said create a server action that generates feedback. And that is exactly what we need to do now. So instead of passing this mock data, I will now say await create feedback. And to it, we have to pass an object of interview ID is interview ID. We also have to pass the user ID, which is equal to user ID. And we have to pass a transcript of messages. The messages, of course, being the entire conversation we've had with the bot, so we can create a proper assessment. Now, this create feedback returns back the feedback ID. So instead of getting the ID, we can get the feedback ID, and we can just rename it to ID. Great. And let's just check whether we have access to these properties, such as interview ID, user ID, and so on. So let me check for the user ID. It's coming as a prop to this agent component. So let me actually see where am I calling the agent component. It is right here, and I think I made a mistake. Instead of the actual type, which is interview, I passed over the user ID. So this should have been user ID right here. And username is of a type string, so we can do it like this. There we go. So now we're passing the proper user ID right into it, and we're generating the feedback. So if we have success and the ID, we're navigating over to the interview details page. It's complaining that it's not receiving the success, and it's possible it's saying that because I forgot to return success of false if something goes wrong. There we go. Now we're good. Perfect. So now we're actually creating feedback, and now we want to see whether it works. So I'll head over to my homepage and try to take one of these interviews right here. Let's take this backend one. I'll click call and try to be very quick with it.
Hello? Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I'm excited to learn more about you and your experience.
Hey, let's dive into the interview.
Sure thing. Can you describe a time you faced a challenging technical problem while working on a project? How did you approach the problem? What resources did you use?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have time right now, so end this interview immediately.
I understand. Thank you for letting me know. If you decide to continue or have any questions later, feel free to reach out. We appreciate your interest, and we'll be in touch soon with any follow-up. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.
Okay, this was pretty short and sweet, right? And we got redirected to the interview feedback page, which is a good sign. And if you head over to your Firestore database, you'll be able to find a new feedback that has been generated for you. I've actually created a couple just to test it out, but for you, there should be just one. So what we need to do next is create a function that'll give us access to that feedback that was created so we can display it on this page. So I'll head back over to general.action.ts and create another server action. Actually, I'll start by copying this get latest interviews and paste it right below. We can use that as a baseline, but I'll rename it to get feedback by interview ID. We are getting the params of get feedback by interview ID params, and we will return not an interview, but this time just a singular feedback. From the params, we can destructure two most important things. The interview ID, so we know for which interview we're providing the feedback for, as well as the user ID, so we know to which user we're providing the feedback. And then we can just try to fetch the feedback from the database by saying feedback await DB collection feedback, where the interview ID is equal to the interview ID, and where the user ID is also equal to the user ID. Limit it to 1 and return it to me. Finally, if we don't have any feedback, so if feedback is empty, in that case, just return null. Else, we can get access to the feedback document by saying feedback docs 0, and then we can return it by saying return an ID of feedback doc.id. And we can also spread out all of the other properties by saying ... feedback doc.data. And then we can close it here and say as feedback. So now we're returning all of the necessary feedback. We have to spell empty properly here. And we are ready to return this last part that I copied from the previous function and get back over into our page so we can fetch it. So let's do just that. I'll head over into this feedback page, and we'll first want to get the ID of the page we're currently on from params. So I can say params, and that's going to be of a type route params. How do we know what these params contain? Well, if you check the URL bar, you'll notice this ID right here, and you'll notice that it says ID here as well, which means that the params will contain the ID, which we can just destructure by saying await params. And of course, we have to say async if we're using await as well. Now that we have the interview ID, we'll also have to have the user's ID. So say const user is equal to await get current user. And then we'll need to get the interview details by saying const interview is equal to await get interview by ID, to which we can pass the ID. Then if there is no interview, we simply want to redirect to a / homepage. But if there is interview, we want to provide the feedback. So I'll say feedback is equal to await get feedback by interview ID, to which we can pass the interview ID as well as the user ID, which is user .id. And this interview ID will just be equal to ID because we're getting it from the params. Great. So now let's see how does this feedback look like by console logging it right here and opening up the terminal. Check this out. We get a very detailed list of feedback with strengths, which apparently we had none, the interview ID, the user ID, the total score of the interview, category scores in terms of communication, and the comment for each category, as well as areas for improvement, final assessment, and when the actual interview was created. Now, the last remaining thing to do is to craft the UI of this interview feedback page and display all the real data we've generated for it. And this was a long and detailed course, so I didn't want you to just follow along. Rather, I prepared 2 exercises, one that deals with UI and JSX, and the other that deals with logic. So, creating the UI of this feedback screen, now that we have gotten all of the details, is your first exercise. So take a look at the design, and then take a look at the data we're getting back, and try to display it on the screen, just by dealing with the JSX within this page. Feel free to pause this video, and I'll provide a solution in 3, 2, 1. So, how did it go? The final solution looks something like this. We have a large title on the top with the overall impression and the date, and then the breakdown. But you know how that looks like. What you care about is how did we make it happen? Well, in this case, I already had a couple of Tailwind CSS classes that significantly helped, but if you went ahead and generated them from scratch right here, that's even better. So I have an H1 right at the top. Then we display the total score out of 100. We take over the created@date and pass it into the day.js to format it. We render the entire final assessment, which is this one right here. And then we map over each different category to show the score as well as the comment for that score. And then finally, we map over the strengths, areas for improvements, and render 2 buttons, one that will allow the user to retake the interview, and the other which will allow it to go back to the dashboard. Hopefully you were able to replicate something that looks like this, given the data and the design we had. And of course, this is something that you really should be looking at on the desktop screen as you have more screen real estate. Now let's go back to the homepage and let's figure out how we can show that we have taken an interview right here. Because right now, for all of these, it says you haven't taken the interview yet. So to fix this, you'll have to head over into the interview card and see right here where we're defining the feedback as null. What you'll have to do there is just fetch the interview feedback by saying if a user ID exists and if the interview ID exists, which I think is just this ID that we have here. Well, if that is the case, then we can await get feedback by interview ID and pass in the interview ID as well as the user ID. Or if the feedback doesn't exist, simply return null. And this interview ID right here, we can set to just ID. And since we're using await, we also have to add async right here. And as soon as you do that, you'll notice that now it's gonna say 15 out of 100, the candidate performed extremely poorly. And the other two we haven't taken yet, so we can take them. Or here, we have a button that allows us to check the feedback, which redirects to the feedback page. Which actually brings me to the second exercise of this course. And that is for you to implement the logic for retaking the interview. This one, I won't just provide to you. I want you to think a bit about how you can implement that logic and then allow the user to retake it. But even without that functionality, our application is amazing. So let's get it deployed. If you think about it, it's already up and running on Vercel, so the only thing we have to do is do a final push. So I'll say git add dot, git commit -m, and we can say show feedback. And git push. There we go. Now, if you head over to your Vercel project, you'll see that our last commit is building, and in about 45 seconds, it should be live on this URL. And check it out. Here, you can sign in using the email you created before, because we're using the same shared Firestore database. And once you're signed in, you'll be able to see the interviews you created, as well as check the feedback on interviews you have taken so far. Everything is working perfectly, and as you know, you can even utilize the workflows functionality to generate another interview.
Hello, Adrian. Let's prepare your interview. I'll ask you a few questions and generate a perfect interview just for you. Are you ready?
Hello. Just checking whether you're working perfectly on the deployed version of the application, and it seems you are.
Glad to hear that everything is working perfectly on the deployed version. Now,
bye.
Back to the interview.
Okay, good. This is great. Everything is working perfectly and we're deployed. And that brings us to the end of this amazing course. You'll learn how to use Firebase Auth and storage to quickly spin up your backend system. And then we used Vapi to get this perfect human-like sounding voice. First time, we paired it with a workflow. So it served as a way for us to gather a lot of different pieces of data and make an API request for us. And then later on, we fed the questions into it alongside some additional information, and we just let it interview us. So huge thanks to Vapi, not just for sponsoring this video, but also for creating such an amazing tool. And of course, if you came to the end of this video, then you'll love what we offer on JS Mastery Pro. We spent a year creating a new and optimized version of the platform that unlocked some completely new ways of teaching. Trust me here, the format and the platform allow me to go so much deeper than we can in our YouTube videos. So check it out and become a member right now, as it's the best and the fastest way to either get your first job or upskill and get a promotion in your career. With that said, thank you so much for coming to the end of this video, and have a wonderful day.